Let's journey back in time a little. Now I'm going to tell you a story. Quietly, calmly, just listen. This is a story about a man who was born in a tiny Georgian town where the dusty streets still remembered the times of ancient kings. A story about a boy who fell asleep to lullabies in the Georgian language and woke up to the shouts of his drunken father. About a young man who dreamed of becoming a priest but became a revolutionary. About a man who went from being the son of a poor shoemaker to the ruler of a vast empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. This story isn't about politics or ideology. It's a tale of a destiny filled with incredible twists and turns, about how a little Georgian boy named Iosif Djugashvili became the man whom millions of people knew by the name of Stalin. I won't judge or evaluate. I'll just tell you what happened, how this man lived, what shaped him, what events surrounded him. A story spanning 74 years in which personal tragedy and great historical upheavals intertwined. Make yourselves comfortable. We begin our story in the distant year of 1878, when in the small Georgian town of Gori, lost among the mountain slopes, a boy was born into the family of a shoemaker, a boy destined to change the course of world history. But for now, he is just an infant crying in the arms of a young woman named Ketivan, while outside the Georgian wind howls and somewhere far away flows the ancient Kura River. Imagine Georgia at the end of the 19th century. It was a special world where the ancient traditions of the Caucasus mixed with the innovations of the Russian Empire. A country that remembered the times of Queen Tamar and great campaigns now lived under the laws of distant St. Petersburg. Georgia had become part of Russia relatively recently, less than a century ago, and the spirit of old independence still hung in the air, mixed with the inevitability of the new order. In every home, people spoke the melodic Georgian language and sang ancient songs passed down from generation to generation. In the evenings, when fog enveloped the mountains and oak logs crackled in the hearths, the elders told legends of ancient heroes, of times when Georgian warriors defended their native land from Persians and Turks. But times were changing. Now young people were studying the Russian language, dreaming of careers in the imperial capital, and old traditions were slowly but surely giving way to new trends. It was a time when the past had not yet completely faded, and the future was already knocking on the door of every home. In this world of contrasts, in the town of Gori, situated at the foot of an ancient fortress on the bank of the Kura River, lived the small Djugashvili family. Their house stood on a narrow street where the cobblestones held the imprints of thousands of feet, from medieval warriors to modern merchants. Here, every stone breathed history, every alleyway remembered legends. The head of the family, Vissarion Djugashvili, was a shoemaker. In those days it was a respectable profession. A good craftsman always had work, as everyone needed shoes, from the peasant to the merchant. Vissarion knew how to make both rough peasant footwear and elegant city shoes. His workshop was located right in the house, and all day long the steady tapping of a hammer on leather could be heard. But Vissarion had a serious flaw that poisoned the life of the whole family. He drank. In those times, drunkenness was the scourge of many working-class families. Hard labor, meager earnings, a lack of entertainment, all this pushed men to the bottle. Vissarion was no exception. When he was sober, he was a master of his craft, even a cheerful man. But when he drank, which happened more and more often, he became aggressive and cruel. His wife, Ketivan, whom everyone at home simply called Keke, was the complete opposite of her husband. The daughter of a former serf gardener, she grew up in an atmosphere of quiet piety and submission to fate. A short woman with kind eyes and soft features, she knew how to find joy in small things and always believed in the best. Keke was illiterate. In those days, literacy was rarely provided to women from simple families, but she possessed natural wisdom and intuition. She sang ancient Georgian songs beautifully and knew many folk tales and superstitions. It was she who created an atmosphere of warmth and comfort in the home, despite all the difficulties. Vissarion and Ketivan's marriage could not be called a happy one. They were too different in character, and they saw life too differently. But in those times, divorce was practically impossible, especially for people of their class. All that was left was to endure and hope that things would change for the better. The first years of their married life brought the couple more sorrow than joy. They had children, but they all died in infancy. In the 19th century, infant mortality was terribly high, especially in poor families. The lack of medical care, unsanitary conditions, and diseases claimed one small life after another. Keke grieved deeply with each loss. She would spend hours praying in a small church, lighting candles for the souls of her infants, asking God to give her at least one child who would survive. Vissarion, on the other hand, hid his pain behind another bottle, becoming even more sullen and irritable. And then, on December 21st, 1878, according to the old style, January 6th, 1879, according to the new, their third son was born. The birth was difficult, and at first it seemed that this infant would not survive either. But the days passed, and the little one grew stronger. Keke did not dare to believe in her happiness, afraid to rejoice too soon. The boy was named Ioseb in honor of Saint Joseph the Betrothed, the patron saint of artisans. The name meant, "God will increase," and his parents sincerely hoped it would bring their son luck. In the family, he was affectionately called Soso, a common Georgian diminutive for the name Ioseb. The first months of little Soso's life were anxious. Keke was afraid to leave him alone even for a minute, constantly listening to his breathing, praying for his health. Vissarion was initially reserved about the birth of his son. They had lost children too many times already, but gradually he too grew attached to the boy and began to make plans for his future. Soso grew up to be a sickly child. He often caught colds, ate poorly, and was weaker than his peers. Keke surrounded him with all the care she could possibly give. She sang him Georgian lullabies, told him fairy tales, and took him to church. The boy grew up in an atmosphere of deep religiosity. His mother read prayers to him, taught him church hymns, and explained the basics of the Christian faith. But Soso's childhood could not be called cloudless. His father drank more with each passing year, and his temper became increasingly unbearable. A drunken Vissarion could yell at his wife, hit her, and sometimes the son got it too. The little boy learned early on to hide when his father came home in high spirits, learned to distinguish by his gait and voice what mood he was in. These early experiences left a serious mark on the child's developing personality. Soso became secretive, cautious, and learned not to show his true feelings. He understood early on that in the world there are the strong and the weak, and that the strong can do whatever they want to the weak. These childhood impressions may have influenced his later attitude toward power and people. Keke did everything she could to protect her son from his father's brutality. She was the only source of warmth and love in his childhood. His mother told him what a remarkable person he could become if he studied well. She dreamed that Soso would get an education and become a priest. This was the pinnacle of the social ladder for a family of their standing. In those days, a priest in a Georgian village or town was an exceptionally important figure. He not only served the liturgy and performed rites, but was also a teacher, an advisor, and often the only literate person in the area. priests were universally respected, had a stable, albeit small, income, and most importantly, they possessed knowledge. Vissarion, however, saw his son's future completely differently. He wanted the boy to follow in his footsteps, to become a craftsman, to master the shoemaking trade. "What does he need those books for?" he would say to his wife. "Let him work with his hands, like an honest man. A trade is a reliable thing. It will always feed a family." Disputes often arose between the parents about their son's future. Keiki insisted that the boy must study to receive a spiritual education. Vissarion considered this a whim and a waste of time. These disagreements further strained the atmosphere in the family, and as always, the weakest one suffered. Little Soso. When the boy turned 6, a misfortune befell him that would affect the rest of his life. While playing with friends in the street, he was hit by a phaeton, a light two-wheeled carriage. The horses were spooked by something and bolted just as Soso ran into the road. The boy's left arm was seriously injured. In those days, medicine was primitive, especially in provincial towns. The local doctor did what he could, but the arm healed improperly. For the rest of his life it remained shorter than his right, bent poorly at the elbow, and his fingers moved with difficulty. This injury was a real tragedy for little Soso. He was already not the strongest among his peers, and now his physical abilities were even more limited. He could not participate in games on equal terms with the other boys, could not fight if he was picked on, and could not perform many common childhood activities. Keiki blamed herself for not watching over her son. She became even more overprotective of him, which only worsened the situation. The boy felt his inadequacy, withdrew into himself, and became increasingly sullen and pensive. But, as is often the case, a physical shortcoming was compensated by the development of other qualities. Soso began to read more, to reflect more. He learned to get his way not by force, but by intelligence and cunning. In games with friends, he preferred the role of the organizer, inventing rules and assigning roles. His peers quickly recognized him as a leader, despite his physical weakness. The boy had a sharp mind, a good memory, and he knew how to persuade and inspire others. These qualities manifested very early and would stay with him for his entire life. And soon, another trial came. When Soso turned 7, he contracted smallpox, one of the most terrible childhood diseases of that time. Smallpox claimed many lives, and those who survived were often disfigured for life. For several weeks, the boy hovered between life and death. Keiki never left his bedside, praying day and night, lighting candles in all the churches of Gori. Even Vissarion, who usually hid his feelings, was seriously frightened. Losing their only surviving son would have been a blow from which the family might not have recovered. Fortunately, Soso survived, but the disease left its marks. His face was covered with pockmarks, small but noticeable. Combined with his injured arm, this made the boy even more distinct, setting him apart from his peers. These physical characteristics seriously influenced the formation of the child's character. He became even more withdrawn and learned to hide his feelings. But at the same time, an iron will develop within him, a desire to prove to everyone, and above all to himself, that he was no worse than others. Later, as an adult, Stalin would carefully retouch his official photographs, hiding the traces of childhood smallpox. He never liked it when artists depicted him too realistically, preferring idealized portraits. His childhood complexes proved to be very persistent, but for now he was just a little boy learning to live with the limitations that fate had imposed on him. And, it must be said, he was learning quite successfully. Soso possessed an amazing ability to adapt to circumstances, to find a way out of the most difficult situations. Keiki saw that her son was special. She became even more determined in her intention to give him a spiritual education. His mother understood that physical labor would be difficult for him due to his injured arm, so it was necessary to develop his mind and acquire knowledge. The family arguments about the boy's future continued. Vissarion insisted on his own way, let his son become a craftsman. But Keke was no less persistent. She was ready to make any sacrifice to give Soso an education. And in the end, her persistence won out. In 1888, when the boy turned 10, he was enrolled in the Gori theological school. This was a serious decision for a family with such a modest income. They had to pay for tuition, buy textbooks, a uniform, and school supplies. Keke economized on everything she possibly could, earning money by sewing and cleaning just to gather the necessary funds. Imagine a 10-year-old boy from a simple working-class family stepping over the threshold of an educational institution for the first time. The Gori Theological School was housed in a beautiful 2-story building in the center of the town. Everything here was new. Clean classrooms with high ceilings, strict rules, and instruction in the Russian language. At home, the family spoke Georgian. It was the native language of both Kiki and Vissarion. They knew Russian poorly, with a strong accent, but at the school it was required not just to speak Russian, but to write it, study Russian grammar, and read Russian literature. For little Soso, this was a real challenge. But the boy turned out to be a capable student. He had an excellent memory, a sharp mind, and a talent for languages. He mastered Russian fairly quickly and soon spoke it with almost no accent. However, some peculiarities of his Georgian pronunciation would remain with him for his entire life. Soso was particularly good at the humanities, literature, history, and church singing. He devoured the Russian classics that were studied at the school. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, Mikhail Yuryevich Lermontov, Nikolai Alexeyevich Nekrasov. He memorized their lines and could recite entire pages. The teachers quickly noticed the gifted student. Soso regularly received the highest marks, and his name was often mentioned at formal assemblies as an example for others to follow. This was pleasing to both the boy and his mother, who had sacrificed so much for his education. But there was another side to studying at the theological school. An atmosphere of strict discipline and tight control over the students' minds prevailed there. The administration carefully ensured that the pupils read only correct literature, thought correct thoughts, and showed no interest in anything that might distract them from studying theology. Any interest in the national culture of Georgia was especially strictly suppressed. The authorities believed that local traditions and language hindered the integration of the borderlands into a unified Russian empire. Therefore, speaking Georgian at the school was forbidden, and the study of Georgian history and literature was discouraged. It was during these years that a spirit of contradiction began to form in the young Ioseb. Officially, he was a model student, received excellent grades, and behaved exemplarily in class. But outside the classroom walls, he secretly read forbidden literature and took an interest in Georgian poetry and the history of his people. The boy had an amazing ability to live a kind of double life. In public, he showed what was expected of him, while keeping his true thoughts and feelings deep inside. This character trait would accompany him throughout his life, the ability to hide his real intentions, to appear as someone he was not. Classmates remembered Soso as a reserved boy who nonetheless knew how to be a leader. He rarely participated in general games. His injured arm hindered him. But he was skilled at organizing others, coming up with interesting activities and obtaining forbidden books. A circle of those who also didn't quite fit within the official requirements always gathered around him. It was at the school that Soso first encountered works that were considered unsuitable for future priests. He read novels about revolutionaries, poems by poets who criticized the existing order, and history books that told of the struggle for freedom. He was particularly impressed by the novel The Patricide by the Georgian writer Alexander Kazbegi. The main character of this work, the noble robber Cobbler, who fought for justice, became a true ideal for the young Soso. Later, he would even take the pseudonym Cobbler in honor of this literary character. The years of study at the school passed quickly. Soso was growing up, his character was forming, and his views on the world were becoming more defined. He formally remained a model student, but internally he was drifting further and further away from the ideals they tried to instill in him. Meanwhile, his mother continued to dream that her son would become a priest. Keke had no suspicion of the processes taking place in her boy's soul. She saw his academic success, heard the teacher's praises, and was happy. Her sacrifices were not in vain. Her son was receiving an excellent education. Vissarion, on the other hand, was drinking himself into oblivion with each passing year. His business was doing worse and worse, he received fewer orders, and the family lived in increasing poverty. Sometimes he would show up at the school drunk, cause scenes, and demand that his son drop out and go to work. This was a terrible humiliation for the boy, who already felt he did not quite belong among his classmates from more affluent families. Eventually, Vissarion drank himself to death and died when Soso was about 15 years old. His father's death was not a great sorrow for the young man. He had brought too much pain and humiliation to the family. It was more of a relief. Now the house was calmer, although even poorer. After graduating from the school with excellent marks, Soso received a recommendation to enter the Tiflis Theological Seminary. This was a significant achievement for the son of a poor shoemaker. The seminary was considered one of the best educational institutions in the entire Transcaucasia. Its graduates became not only priests, but also teachers, officials, and public figures. Entering the seminary meant that the young man would receive a higher spiritual education, study theology, philosophy, ancient languages, and church history. This opened up broad prospects for him in life. Keke was happier than ever. Her dream was coming true. Her son was truly on the path to the priesthood. She imagined him serving the liturgy in a beautiful church, parishioners respectfully calling him Father, and how he would be able to help people with his knowledge and spiritual authority. In the autumn of 1894, 16-year-old Ioseb Jugashvili set off for Tiflis to continue his education. His mother saw her only son off with tears in her eyes, tears of joy and sadness at the same time. Joyful, because a great future awaited him. Sad, because now they would see each other rarely. The journey from Gori to Tiflis took a whole day by horse. The young man traveled in an old cart along a mountain road, admiring the majestic landscapes of his native Caucasus. He did not yet know that this trip would become a turning point in his life, that in the capital of Georgia, an encounter with ideas that would radically change his worldview awaited him. Tiflis greeted him with the noise of a big city, a colorful crowd on the streets, and a mix of languages and cultures. Georgians and Armenians, Russians and Azerbaijanis, Persians and Kurds lived here. The city bustled with trade and crafts. Intellectual life thrived here, with theaters and educational institutions in operation. The theological seminary was housed in an imposing building in the center of the city. The rules here were even stricter than at the school. The seminarians lived on a rigid schedule: wake up, prayer, breakfast, classes, lunch, more classes, dinner, evening prayer, lights out. Any deviation from the established routine was severely punished, but it was here, within the walls of this bastion of orthodoxy, that the young Ioseb Jugashvili first encountered revolutionary ideas. Paradoxically, the seminary became for him not a school of faith, but a school of rebellion. Here he learned about the existence of forbidden literature, underground circles, and people who dreamed of changing the world. This was a completely different life, full of secrets and dangers, of the romance of fighting for justice. And the 16-year-old youth from provincial Gori, having barely crossed the threshold of the seminary, had already begun to take his first steps on the path that would lead him to revolution. But for now, he was just a first-year seminarian, curiously exploring the new world that had opened up before him. Ahead of him lay years of study, spiritual seeking, first serious passions and disappointments. An encounter with the teachings of Karl Marx awaited him, which would completely overturn his worldview. For the time being, he was simply walking through the corridors of the seminary, getting used to his new life, and had no idea that in a few years he would be expelled from this institution for revolutionary propaganda, and a quarter of a century later, he would become one of the leaders of a revolution that would destroy a 1,000-year-old empire. Tiflis, at the end of the 19th century, was an amazing city. Imagine a place where East and West met, where the ancient traditions of the Caucasus coexisted with European innovations. It was a city of contrasts. Luxurious mansions of Armenian merchants stood next to the wretched hovels of craftsmen. Orthodox churches neighbored mosques and synagogues, and the air was a mix of the aromas of Eastern spices and the sounds of different languages. It was to this vibrant city that 16-year-old Ioseb Yugashvili arrived in the autumn of 1894. He was full of hopes and expectations, but he did not yet suspect that these years would become a time of radical re-evaluation of all the values he had absorbed in his childhood. The Tiflis Theological Seminary was an impressive 3-story building of gray stone. Its walls had seen more than one generation of future priests, and it seemed that nothing could shake the unshakable foundations of this bastion of orthodoxy. The corridors smelled of incense and old books, and the walls were adorned with icons and portraits of church hierarchs. The daily routine at the seminary was scheduled down to the minute. Wake up at 6 in the morning to the sound of a bell, morning prayer, a modest breakfast, then classes until lunch. After a short rest, more lessons, the evening meal, a mandatory walk in the courtyard under the supervision of wardens, evening prayers, and lights out. Every day repeated with monotonous precision. The seminarians studied church history, dogmatic theology, liturgics, ancient Greek, and Latin. Great attention was paid to church singing. Future priests had to be able to serve the liturgy beautifully. Secular subjects were also present in the curriculum: Russian literature, mathematics, physics, but they were considered secondary. At first glance, Ioseb seemed to be a model seminarian. He diligently attended all classes, received good grades, especially in the humanities, and participated in the church choir. The teachers noted his aptitude for languages and literature. The young man's memory was phenomenal. He could reproduce entire pages of text he had read from memory. But behind this outward propriety, a completely different life was hidden. As early as his first year, Ioseb fell in with a group of seminarians who secretly read forbidden literature. In those times, censorship was very strict, especially in religious educational institutions. Works that criticized the existing order, the authority of the church, or the autocracy were banned. But forbidden fruit, as is known, is sweet. The seminarians found ways to obtain the necessary books, passed them to one another, and discussed what they had read in secluded places. This was their small revolution against the suffocating atmosphere of the seminary. Ioseb quickly became one of the leaders of this underground circle. He had a special talent for finding the right books. He knew whom to ask and where to get things. Gradually, a circle of like-minded people formed around him, who eagerly devoured everything written against the official ideology. The first forbidden books that fell into the young man's hands were the works of Russian revolutionary Democrats. Nikolai Gavrilovich Chernyshevsky with his novel What Is to Be Done, Nikolai Alexandrovich Dobrolyubov, Dmitry Ivanovich Pisarev. Their ideas about the need for fundamental changes in society made a huge impression on the impressionable seminarian. Chernyshevsky's book had a particularly strong effect on him. The image of Rakhmetov, a revolutionary who dedicated his entire life to the struggle for the people's happiness, was a real revelation for Ioseb. Here was a completely different ideal of serving people, not through church sermons, but through revolutionary activity. But this was only the beginning. Gradually, more and more radical works fell into the hands of the seminarians. They read the works of the populists, anarchists, and socialists. Each new book opened up new horizons for them, new ways of understanding the world. A particularly important moment was his acquaintance with Marxist literature. The first volume of Karl Marx's Das Kapital made a stunning impression on Ioseb. Here was a whole system of views on society, an explanation of the causes of social injustice, and a program for fighting for a better future. Marx wrote that the history of humanity is the history of class struggle, that the capitalist system would inevitably produce its own gravedigger in the form of the proletariat, and that the future belonged to socialism. These ideas fell on fertile ground. The young man had already seen the injustice of the world around him and felt the need for change. Reading Marxist literature completely changed the seminarian's worldview. Whereas before he had sought answers to questions about the meaning of life in religion, now he found them in revolutionary theory. Instead of serving God, he saw the possibility of serving the people. Instead of waiting for justice in the afterlife, he saw the struggle for justice in this life. Gradually, Ioseb distanced himself more and more from religion. He still formally participated in church services and studied theological subjects, but he did so automatically, without inner involvement. His real life began for him outside the seminary walls, in the world of forbidden books and secret meetings. The seminary authorities could not fail to notice the changes happening to one of their best students. Ioseb became more withdrawn, absent-minded in class, and sometimes allowed himself to make audacious remarks. During searches of his cell, forbidden literature was found. He was summoned to the rector for explanations several times, but the young man learned to play a cat-and-mouse game with the administration. He would formally repent of his transgressions and promise to reform, but he continued to do the same things, only more cautiously. He had an amazing ability to appear submissive and repentant while hiding his true thoughts and plans. In his third year, Ioseb took a decisive step. He established connections with underground revolutionary circles outside the seminary. At that time, various social democratic groups were active in Tiflis, distributing Marxist literature, organizing workers' strikes, and training professional revolutionaries. The first contacts with real revolutionaries made a huge impression on the seminarian. These were people who had completely dedicated themselves to the struggle for the restructuring of society. They lived from hand to mouth, constantly risking their freedom and lives, but they burned with the idea of liberating the working masses from the yoke of capitalism. Among them were railway workshop laborers, students, and intellectuals from various social strata. They were united by a belief in Marxist doctrine and a readiness to sacrifice everything for the triumph of socialist ideals. A spirit of camaraderie, mutual aid, and selfless devotion to the common cause reigned in their midst. Ioseb began to regularly attend the secret meetings of the Social Democrats. He listened to lectures on Marxist theory, participated in discussions of tactical issues, and helped distribute illegal literature. Gradually, he became a full-fledged member of the revolutionary underground. He became particularly active in working among the laborers. Tiflis had many industrial enterprises, railway workshops, tobacco factories, small plants. Working conditions there were harsh, wages were meager, and the workday lasted 12 to 14 hours. This was fertile ground for revolutionary propaganda. Ioseb proved to be a natural agitator. He could explain the reasons for the workers' dire situation in simple, understandable language, show who was to blame, and talk about the possibility of changing their lives for the better. He had a gift of persuasion, an ability to find an approach to very different people. The seminarian created several workers' circles where they studied the basics of Marxist theory, discussed current events, and planned collective actions. He regularly spoke at illegal meetings, and his speeches were very popular among the listeners. But such active underground activity could not go unnoticed. The Okhrana, the secret police of the Russian Empire, was closely watching the revolutionary groups. It had an extensive network of informants who infiltrated underground organizations and reported on their activities. The seminary also had its own snitches, seminarians who, for small privileges, informed the authorities about unreliable comrades. Gradually, the administration received more and more information about the revolutionary activities of Ioseb Yugashvili. In May of 1899, shortly before the final exams, he was summoned to the seminary's rector. It was a decisive conversation. The rector presented Ioseb with specific accusations of reading forbidden literature, participating in illegal circles, and conducting revolutionary propaganda among the workers. The young man could have repented, promised to reform, perhaps even remained at the seminary. But he chose a different path. He openly declared his beliefs, said that he had no intention of abandoning his revolutionary activities, and that he considered the struggle for social justice more important than a church career. On May 29, 1899, Ioseb Yugashvili was expelled from the Tiflis Theological Seminary for non-attendance at examinations for unknown reasons. The official wording concealed the true reasons for his expulsion. The administration did not want to draw attention to revolutionary activity within the walls of a religious educational institution. For Keke, this news was a terrible blow. Her entire life had been dedicated to one goal, to give her son a spiritual education, to help him become a priest. She did not understand what had happened, why her son, who had studied so well, was suddenly expelled. The woman cried, reproached Ioseb, and begged him to ask for forgiveness and return to the seminary. But for the young man himself, the expulsion was a liberation. Now he did not have to hide his beliefs, live a double life, or pretend to be someone he was not. He could fully devote himself to the revolutionary struggle, to become a professional revolutionary. True, the question arose of how to live now. He had not received a spiritual education and had not learned any other professions. His family was poor and could not help him financially. He needed to earn a living somehow while continuing his underground activities. At first, Ioseb got by with odd jobs. He gave private lessons to children from wealthy families, worked as an accountant at the Tiflis Physical Observatory, and performed various small errands. The pay was meager, but it was enough for a modest lifestyle. He devoted his main time and energy to revolutionary work. Now that he did not have to spend time studying at the seminary, he could fully concentrate on political activity. He created new workers' circles, organized strikes, and distributed illegal literature. By the end of 1899, 20-year-old Ioseb Yugashvili had become one of the most active social democrats in Tiflis. He was known in the working-class districts, his speeches drew large audiences, and his articles were printed in underground newspapers. But revolutionary activity in the Russian Empire was an extremely dangerous occupation. The Okhrana was not asleep. Its agents constantly monitored suspicious individuals, and searches and arrests were regularly conducted. The life of an underground activist was full of risk and uncertainty. On May 1st, 1900, An illegal May Day celebration took place in Tiflis, a secret gathering of workers and social democrats in honor of the International Workers' Holiday. Ioseb was one of the organizers of this event. He delivered a fiery speech calling for a struggle against capitalist oppression, but the police had been warned about the planned gathering. The May Day celebration was dispersed, and many participants were arrested. Ioseb managed to escape, but his description was recorded, and a real hunt for him began. He spent the following months living illegally. He had to constantly change apartments, avoid visiting familiar places, and use false documents. It was a harsh school of conspiracy that would serve him well in the future. Despite the danger, he continued his active revolutionary work. He created a new underground organization, the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This party had been founded in 1898 and united all Russian Marxists. Ioseb became one of the leaders of the local party organization. He was responsible for propaganda among the workers, organizing strikes, and creating new party cells. The work was intense and dangerous, but it brought satisfaction. He saw that his activities were yielding real results. The workers were increasingly participating in strikes. More and more people were becoming interested in social democratic ideas, and the circulation of illegal publications was constantly growing. It seemed that the revolution was just around the corner, that with a little more effort, the old world would collapse, giving way to a just socialist society. But the Okhrana was not idle either. On March 21st, 1902, on the night before Easter, mass arrests took place throughout Tiflis. The police arrested most of the leaders of the local social democratic organization, including Ioseb Yugashvili. The arrest was his first serious test. Before this, he had only heard stories about prisons. Now he experienced them firsthand. At first, he was placed in the Meteki Castle, an ancient fortress in the center of Tiflis, used as a prison for political inmates. The conditions of confinement were harsh. Damp cells, meager food, limited walks, constant searches. But for a seasoned underground activist, this was not the worst ordeal. The worst part was the uncertainty. No one knew how the investigation would end, what sentence awaited the arrested. During the investigation, Ioseb behaved with fortitude. He did not betray his comrades, did not reveal the organization's secrets, and did not confess to his actions. The investigators tried to persuade him to cooperate, promising a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony against other revolutionaries, but he remained steadfast. The investigation lasted for more than a year. Finally, in July of 1903, the verdict was announced. Ioseb Yugashvili was sentenced to 3 years of exile in eastern Siberia. This was a relatively lenient punishment. Many of his comrades received longer sentences or hard labor. They were sent to exile in a convoy, on foot, in shackles, with stops at transit prisons. The journey from Tiflis to the place of exile took several months. It was a difficult ordeal, but it further hardened the character of the young revolutionary. The place of exile was the village of Novaya Uda in the Irkutsk Governorate. It was a remote Siberian village lost among the vast taiga. Here, Ioseb was to spend 3 years under the supervision of the local police, without the right to leave the village limits. But exile did not become a period of inaction for him. He continued to study Marxist theory, wrote articles for underground publications, and maintained contact with comrades at liberty. Most importantly, he planned to escape. He had no intention of meekly serving out his sentence. 4 months after arriving in exile, in January of 1904, he managed to escape. It was a daring escape in the middle of the Siberian winter. He reached the nearest railway station, boarded a train, and headed back to Tiflis. The escape showed that the young revolutionary possessed not only theoretical knowledge, but also practical skills of conspiracy. He knew how to plan complex operations, forge documents, find helpers, and risk his life to achieve his goal. Returning to Tiflis, Ioseb once again plunged into revolutionary work. But now the conditions for his activities had become even more difficult. The police knew him by sight, and he was under constant surveillance. He had to be extremely cautious, frequently change apartments, and use various pseudonyms. It was at this time that he began to sign his articles with the pseudonym Koba, in honor of the hero of his favorite novel by Alexander Kazbegi. This name would become his main pseudonym for many years, until a more famous one appeared, Stalin. The revolutionary situation in the country was escalating. The Russo-Japanese War began, which brought a series of defeats to Russia and increased dissatisfaction with the existing regime. On January 9th, 1905, Bloody Sunday occurred, the shooting of a peaceful demonstration of workers in St. Petersburg. This event became the spark that ignited the fire of the First Russian Revolution. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and unrest in the army and navy began all across the country. Revolutionary parties emerged from the underground, and their activities became more open and massive. The time for which the underground activists had been preparing for so long had arrived. Ioseb threw himself headfirst into revolutionary work. He organized strikes at enterprises in Tiflis, led combat squads, and participated in armed clashes with the police. This was a period of the greatest activity and romance of the revolutionary struggle. But the revolution required not only enthusiasm, but also money. Funds were needed for weapons, illegal printing presses, and the maintenance of professional revolutionaries. And here, Ioseb proved himself to be a talented organizer of expropriations, that is, revolutionary robberies of banks and treasuries. The most famous operation was the robbery of the Tiflis branch of the State Bank on June 12, 1907. This operation was planned and executed under Koba's leadership with surgical precision. As a result, the revolutionaries seized a huge sum for those times, more than 300,000 rubles. But gradually, the revolution began to decline. The government managed to suppress the main centers of the uprising, impose martial law in most provinces, and arrest thousands of revolutionaries. A period of reaction began, when underground activity once again became extremely dangerous. In March of 1908, Ioseb was arrested for the second time. This time he was accused not only of revolutionary propaganda, but also of organizing armed robberies. The investigation lasted almost 2 years, and in the end he was sentenced to exile in Solvychegodsk, Vologda Governorate, for a term of 2 years. But he escaped from this exile as well, in June of 1909. Again, an illegal life, again the constant danger of arrest, again revolutionary work in the underground. Such was the life of a professional revolutionary at the beginning of the 20th century. Over the next 8 years, from 1909 to 1917, Ioseb Yugashvili was arrested 5 more times, sent into exile 6 times, and escaped 4 times. It was a constant game of cat and mouse with the Okhrana, a game in which the stakes were freedom and sometimes life itself. But each arrest and each exile only tempered his character, developed his skills of conspiracy, and strengthened his faith in the correctness of his chosen path. He became an increasingly experienced underground activist, an increasingly skillful organizer, and an increasingly devoted adherent to the idea of world revolution. And ahead of him lay events that would overturn the entire Russian Empire. The First World War was approaching, which would bring unprecedented calamities and create the conditions for a new revolution. And then the long years of experience in underground struggle would serve Iosif Yugashvili to the fullest extent. But for now, he was just one of many professional revolutionaries who, in remote Siberian villages, dreamed of the day when the hated Tsarist regime would fall and a just socialist society would arise in its place. February of 1917 became a turning point not only in the life of Iosif Yugashvili, but also in the fate of a vast empire. Imagine Russia at that time, a country exhausted by 3 years of war, where millions of soldiers had perished on the fronts, where hunger and devastation reigned in the rear. It was an empire on the brink of catastrophe, where the old order could no longer hold, and the new had not yet been born. At this time, Iosif was in his last exile in the remote village of Kureka, lost in the vast Siberian tundra. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly harsh, even by Siberian standards. Temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero, blizzards raged for weeks, and it seemed as if this white desert would swallow all living things. But even in this remote place, news of what was happening in the capital and throughout the country reached the exiled revolutionary. From letters from comrades, from occasional newspapers brought by rare travelers, he learned of growing discontent, of strikes at factories, of unrest in the army. Iosif understood that something important was approaching, that the years of underground struggle and exile had not been in vain. The revolution, which he had dreamed of since his seminary days, was finally knocking at the door, and he had to be ready for it. He had to be where the fate of the country was being decided. When the news of the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II arrived in March of 1917, Iosif was not surprised. He had been waiting for this event, preparing for it his entire conscious life. Now the main question was, what to do next? How to use the opportunities that had opened up to achieve the ultimate goal, the construction of a socialist society. The journey from Siberia to Petrograd took more than a week. Iosif traveled in overcrowded wagons along with thousands of other people who were rushing to the capital of the revolution. On the trains, debates about the country's future raged. Plans for transformation were made, and hopes for a better life were born. Petrograd greeted him with a spring flood of revolutionary enthusiasm. The city was unrecognizable. Rallies and demonstrations were taking place on the streets. The walls of buildings were covered with proclamations and slogans, and passionate speeches by orators could be heard everywhere. It seemed that all of Russia had awakened from a centuries-long sleep and was demanding change. But revolution is not only a celebration, but also a struggle. The overthrow of the Tsar was only the beginning, the first stage of a long journey. Now, various political forces had to decide which path the country would take, the path of bourgeois democratic reforms or the path of socialist transformations. The provisional government, which came to power after the Tsar's abdication, consisted mainly of liberals and moderate socialists. They wanted to turn Russia into a parliamentary republic on the model of Western European countries. Continuing the war with Germany, protecting private property and gradual reforms, these were their main slogans. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, put forward a completely different program. They demanded an immediate exit from the war, the transfer of land to the peasants, and the transfer of all power to the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. Their slogan, "All power to the Soviets," sounded louder and louder and found more and more supporters among ordinary people. Iosif Yugashvili, upon returning from exile, immediately joined the party work. His many years of experience in underground activities, his knowledge of local conditions, and his ability to work with people made him one of the leaders of the Petrograd Bolshevik organization. But there was no unity in the party. Many old Bolsheviks believed that Russia was not yet ready for a socialist revolution, that it was necessary to support the provisional government and wait for the country to go through a full cycle of bourgeois democratic development. They feared that premature attempts to seize power would lead to defeat and the rout of the revolutionary movement. Lenin, however, who returned from emigration in April, took a much more radical position. In his famous April Theses, he called for immediate preparations for a socialist revolution, for the overthrow of the provisional government, and for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Ioseb supported Lenin's line. His life experience told him that the revolutionary moment should not be missed, that the popular masses were ready for radical changes. He saw the mood of the workers and soldiers, understood their demands, and felt their readiness for decisive action. The summer of 1917 was spent in continuous political struggle. The provisional government tried to stabilize the situation, continued the war, and postponed the resolution of the land issue. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, strengthened their positions in the Soviets, created combat organizations, and prepared for the decisive battle. During this time, Ioseb was mainly engaged in party organizational work. He was not a brilliant orator like Leon Davidovich Trotsky, nor did he possess the theoretical genius of Lenin, but he knew how to patiently and methodically build the party apparatus, select personnel, and ensure communication between various organizations. In July, the Bolsheviks attempted an uprising, but it was suppressed. Lenin went into hiding, and many party leaders were arrested. It seemed that the revolutionary movement had suffered a defeat, that the provisional government had managed to take control of the situation. But this was only a temporary lull before the storm. The economic crisis deepened, the war continued to devour human and material resources, and the discontent of the popular masses grew. By autumn, it became clear that the country was on the verge of new upheavals. The decisive event was the mutiny of General Lavr Georgievich Kornilov in August. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief attempted to establish a military dictatorship, moved troops on Petrograd, and demanded the dissolution of the Soviets. It was an attempted right-wing coup that could have led to the establishment of a military monarchist regime. To combat the Kornilov affair, the provisional government was forced to turn to the Bolsheviks for help. Arrested revolutionaries were released from prisons, Red Guard detachments were issued weapons, and agitation among Kornilov's soldiers was permitted. The mutiny was suppressed, but its consequences proved catastrophic for the provisional government. The popular masses saw that the liberals could not protect the gains of the revolution, that only the Bolsheviks were ready to fight decisively against counter-revolution. The authority of Lenin and his party rose sharply. During these days, Ioseb proved himself to be a skillful organizer. He coordinated the actions of the Red Guard detachments, ensured communication between different districts of the city, and participated in the subversion of Kornilov's units. His composure and practicality were very useful in critical moments. By October, the situation was ripe for a decisive blow. The Bolsheviks had a majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, controlled a significant part of the army and navy, and enjoyed the support of the broad popular masses. Lenin insisted on an immediate uprising before the favorable situation changed. Preparations for the uprising were carried out in deep secrecy. A military revolutionary committee was created to lead the operation. Ioseb became a member of this committee and was responsible for communication with the national regions and for coordinating actions in the Transcaucasia. On October 25th, Old Style, November 7th, New Style, the uprising began. Unlike the February Revolution, which was a spontaneous explosion of popular anger, the October Revolution was a carefully planned operation. The Bolsheviks knew what they were doing, had clear goals, and ready plans to achieve them. The uprising unfolded according to a pre-developed scenario. Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers occupied key points in the city: railway stations, bridges, the post office, telegraph, and power stations. Resistance was minimal. The provisional government found itself completely isolated and helpless. By the evening of October 25th, most of the city was in the hands of the insurgents. The provisional government took refuge in the Winter Palace under the protection of a small guard and a women's battalion. The storming of the palace, which would later be celebrated in films and books, was actually a rather peaceful event. The defenders surrendered with almost no resistance. During these days, Ioseb was at the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the revolution. He maintained contact with the provinces, coordinated actions in the national regions, and participated in making the most important decisions. His role in the October Revolution was not as visible as that of Trotsky or other orators, but it was no less important. The victory in Petrograd was only the beginning. It was necessary to hold on to power, spread the revolution throughout the country, and deal with the inevitable resistance of the overthrown classes. Ahead of the Bolsheviks lay years of civil war, economic ruin, and international isolation. At the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which opened on the day the Winter Palace was taken, the Bolsheviks gained a majority. The Congress adopted a decree on peace, a promise to immediately begin negotiations to exit the war, and a decree on land, the transfer of all land to the peasants without redemption. The first Soviet government was formed, the Council of People's Commissars, headed by Lenin. Ioseb Yugashvili was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities. This was a very important position in a multinational country where the national question had always been one of the most acute. The new government proclaimed the right of nations to self-determination up to and including secession. This was a revolutionary principle that was intended to attract the oppressed peoples of the former empire to the side of the Bolsheviks. Ioseb, as a man who himself came from a national periphery, understood the importance of this issue well, but it was easier to proclaim new principles than to implement them. The old ruling classes were not going to voluntarily give up power. The first armed clashes between the Bolsheviks and their opponents began as early as November. The situation was particularly difficult in the national borderlands. In Finland, Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and the Transcaucasia, local nationalists tried to use the revolutionary situation to create independent states. Not all of them were ready to recognize the authority of the Bolsheviks. As People's Commissar for Nationalities, Ioseb had to solve these extremely complex problems. It was necessary to find a balance between the right of nations to self-determination and the need to preserve the country's unity, between supporting the national liberation movement and fighting against bourgeois nationalists. The question of Georgia was particularly painful for him. His homeland was under the control of the Mensheviks, who had declared independence and refused to recognize Soviet power. The Georgian Mensheviks, led by Noe Nikolozovich Jordania, enjoyed the support of the majority of the population and had even received recognition from the Western powers. This created a very difficult personal situation for Ioseb. On the one hand, he was loyal to the Bolshevik Party and Soviet power. On the other hand, he could not look on indifferently as his native Georgia separated from Russia and followed a capitalist path of development. For the time being, they had to put up with the existence of an independent Georgia. The Bolsheviks did not have the strength to immediately solve all the national problems. The main task was to hold on to power in the center of the country and prepare for the inevitable civil war. And the war was already beginning. General Alexei Maximovich Kaledin raised a rebellion on the Don. General Laver Georgievich Kornilov escaped from prison and began to form the volunteer army, and Admiral Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak appeared in Siberia. All opponents of Soviet power, from monarchists to right-wing socialists, united against it. the Civil War began, the most terrible ordeal in the country's history. It was not just a struggle for power, but a struggle of two irreconcilable world views, two different visions for the future of Russia. On one side stood those who wanted to return to the old order, or at least stop at a bourgeois democratic path of development. On the other, those who were ready to go to the end in building a new socialist society. At the beginning of the Civil War, Ioseb combined his duties as People's Commissar for Nationalities with participation in military actions. Lenin sent him to the most threatened sectors of the front, where it was necessary to restore order, strengthen discipline, and ensure supplies. His first serious combat test was the defense of Tsaritsyn, an important strategic point on the Volga. In the summer of 1918, the white troops of General Pyotr Nikolaevich Krasnov tried to capture this city in order to link up with other anti-Soviet forces. Ioseb arrived in Tsaritsyn as an extraordinary plenipotentiary of the Council of Defense. His task was to organize the supply of bread to the capital from the rich southern regions. But it turned out that first, it was necessary to defend Tsaritsyn itself from the advancing White Guards. The situation in the city was critical. The Red Army was still being formed, there was a shortage of experienced commanders, discipline was weak, and supplies were poorly organized. The Whites had an advantage in military experience and organization. It seemed that the fall of Tsaritsyn was only a matter of time, but Ioseb proved himself to be a talented organizer and a tough leader. He established iron discipline in the troops, shot several panic-mongers and deserters, organized the mobilization of all able-bodied men, and created an effective supply system. His work with the command staff was particularly important. Many officers of the old army had gone over to the side of the Whites, and those who remained to serve the Reds were suspected of political unreliability. Ioseb solved this problem radically. He began to promote people from the masses to command posts who compensated for their lack of military education with revolutionary enthusiasm and dedication to the cause. One such promoted man was Kliment Yefremovich Voroshilov, a former locksmith who proved to be a brave and skillful commander. It was in Tsaritsyn that the friendship between Stalin and Voroshilov began, which would last for decades. The defense of Tsaritsyn lasted several months. The Whites approached the city almost at point-blank range several times, but each time the Red troops repelled their attacks. Ioseb personally participated in the battles, exposed himself to danger, and set an example of courage for his subordinates. But his leadership methods caused discontent in Moscow. Lenin received complaints about the high-handedness of Stalin's entourage, about conflicts with military specialists, and about ignoring orders from the center. Particularly sharp friction arose with the People's Commissar for Military Affairs, Leon Davidovich Trotsky. Trotsky was a proponent of recruiting former Tsarist officers, whom he called military specialists, into the Red Army. He believed that without their experience and knowledge, it was impossible to create a combat-ready army capable of winning the Civil War. Ioseb regarded this policy with great suspicion. He did not trust former officers, considering them potential traitors, and preferred to promote commanders from among the workers and peasants. This conflict of approaches became the source of a long-standing confrontation between the two Bolshevik leaders. In October of 1918, Ioseb was recalled from Tsaritsyn at Trotsky's insistence. Formally, this was explained by the need to use him on other sectors of the front, but in reality, it was the result of their personal conflict. Nevertheless, the defense of Tsaritsyn was successful. The city held out, the Whites were unable to break through to Moscow from the south, and the strategic initiative remained with the Reds. This success greatly raised Ioseb's authority in the party and among the military. His next appointment was to the Eastern Front, where Red troops were facing the units of Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. Here, Ioseb again demonstrated his organizational skills and managed to turn the tide of military operations in favor of the Reds. He particularly distinguished himself during the capture of Perm in the winter of 1918 to 1919. This important Ural city had been captured by the Whites as a result of betrayal and panic among the Red troops. The loss of Perm created a threat to the entire Eastern Front. Ioseb arrived on the scene as an extraordinary plenipotentiary to investigate the causes of the defeat. He conducted a thorough investigation, identified the culprits, and took harsh measures to restore discipline. A few months later, Perm was recaptured, and Kolchak began his retreat into Siberia. By the end of 1919, it became clear that the Bolsheviks were winning the civil war. The White armies were defeated or retreating to the outskirts of the country. The interventionists began to evacuate their troops, and Soviet power controlled the main territory of the former Russian Empire. Ioseb Yugashvili also had a hand in this victory. His abilities as a military organizer, his skill in working with people, and his iron will in critical situations helped the Reds to prevail over their opponents. The war tempered his character and gave him rich experience in leadership under extreme conditions. But most importantly, the Civil War made him one of the leading figures in the Bolshevik Party. If before the revolution he had been an ordinary underground activist, and in the first months of Soviet power, one of many commissars, then, by the end of the war, he had become a recognized military and political leader. True, his relations with some comrades became complicated. The conflict with Trotsky over military policy grew into a serious personal confrontation. Tensions also arose with other leaders who considered Ioseb's methods too harsh and his ambitions excessive. But for now, these contradictions did not come to the surface. The party was united by a common struggle, and all forces were directed towards victory over external enemies. Intra-party disputes were postponed until better times, and times were indeed changing. The Civil War was ending, and the country was beginning to transition to peaceful construction. It was necessary to restore the ruined economy, establish a normal life, and resolve issues of state structure. In March of 1920, at the Ninth Party Congress, Ioseb Jugashvili was elected to the Politburo of the Central Committee, the highest governing body of the Bolsheviks. This meant that he had entered the small circle of people who made the most important decisions about the fate of the country. And in April of 1922, an event occurred that radically changed his position in the party. He was elected General Secretary of the Central Committee, a post that at the time seemed purely technical, related to managing party paperwork. Many comrades did not attach much importance to this appointment. Trotsky was busy with military affairs, Grigory Yevseyevich Zinoviev and Lev Borisovich Kamenev were in charge of Petrograd and Moscow, and Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin was developing theoretical issues. Let Ioseb handle the boring organizational work, but they underestimated the opportunities that this position provided. The General Secretary controlled personnel appointments, managed the party apparatus, and had access to all information. In a situation where the party was becoming the main force in the country, this meant enormous power. Ioseb understood the significance of his new post better than others. He began to patiently and methodically strengthen his positions, place loyal people in key posts, and create a personal network of influence. It was a long and painstaking job, but it was precisely this work that ultimately brought him victory in the struggle for power. For the time being, however, all the most important decisions were made by Lenin. The leader of the revolution, despite his fatigue and the first signs of illness, remained the undisputed leader of the party and the state. But what would happen when he was gone? Who would be able to take his place? This question was becoming more and more relevant. In the spring of 1922, Lenin suffered his first stroke. He partially recovered, but it was already clear that his days of active work were numbered. And ahead, the country faced new trials and new tasks. It was necessary not only to build socialism in one country, but also to prepare for the inevitable clash with the capitalist encirclement. And at the helm of this process had to be a person with an iron will, organizational talent, and boundless devotion to the cause. Such a person, as subsequent events would show, would turn out to be Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, who took the pseudonym Stalin, Man of Steel. But for now, he was just one of Lenin's comrades, albeit one holding a very important post in the party hierarchy. In the last days of December 1922, in Gorky near Moscow, an event took place that would determine the future destiny not only of the Soviet Union, but of the entire world. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the leader of the World Revolution, the man who had turned the course of history, lay in his study and dictated to his secretary what would later be called his political testament. A third stroke had deprived him of the ability to speak and write normally, but his mind remained clear, and he understood that he had very little time left. In those critical days, Lenin was thinking about the future of the party, about who could continue the work he had started after his death. And what he saw caused him serious concern. A split was brewing in the leadership, contradictions were growing among his comrades, and each of the leaders considered himself the worthy successor. Vladimir Ilyich was particularly worried about the growing power of the party's general secretary, Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin. In a year and a half in this post, he had managed to concentrate enormous authority in his hands, create an extensive network of personal supporters, and effectively control the party apparatus. Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has concentrated boundless authority in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution, Lenin dictated. These words would become prophetic, but for now, few suspected what the concentration of power in the hands of one man could lead to. To understand how Iosif Vissarionovich came to this position, one must go back several years, to the time when the Civil War ended and the party began the transition to peaceful construction. In 1921, the country was in a state of profound crisis. 7 years of continuous wars, first the World War, then the Civil War, had turned the once mighty empire into ruins. Industry was destroyed, agriculture had fallen into decline, transport was not working, and cities were starving. The policy of war communism, which had helped the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, proved ineffective in peacetime conditions. The forced requisition of food from the peasants caused their resentment. The nationalization of all enterprises led to economic paralysis, and the abolition of money and market relations created chaos in supplies. The culmination of the crisis was the Kronstadt Rebellion in March of 1921. Sailors and Red Army soldiers, who had recently been the mainstay of Soviet power, demanded the democratization of the political system, freedom of trade, and the release of political prisoners. The rebellion was suppressed with heavy losses, but it showed that the old methods of governance had exhausted themselves. Radical changes were needed, a new economic policy capable of lifting the country out of the ruins. At the 10th Party Congress in March of 1921, Lenin announced the transition to the new economic policy, NEP. Instead of food requisitioning, a food tax was introduced, private trade was permitted, small enterprises were transferred to private hands, and monetary relations were restored. This was a forced but wise measure. The NEP allowed the country to begin its recovery, improve the supply to cities, and establish a normal life. but at the same time, it created new problems and contradictions that would define the intra-party struggle throughout the 1920s. Many Bolsheviks perceived the NEP as a retreat from socialist ideals, as a return to capitalism. They saw how the nepmen, private traders and entrepreneurs, were getting rich, how restaurants and cabarets were appearing in the cities, and how property inequality was growing. The old underground activists, who had gone through prisons and exile for the triumph of socialist ideals, experienced the NEP particularly painfully. They could not understand why the revolution was necessary if they now had to restore what they had so painstakingly destroyed. Under these conditions, various factions began to form within the party, each offering its own path for further development. Some considered the NEP a temporary measure and demanded a return to a direct path to socialism as soon as possible. Others believed that market relations would have to be maintained for a long time. During these years, Iosif Vissarionovich took a rather cautious position. He supported Lenin's line, did not openly align with any of the factions, and tried to stay away from sharp discussions. He was more interested in the practical work of strengthening the party apparatus. The post of General Secretary, which he received in April of 1922, was not perceived as particularly important at the time. It was a technical post, related to keeping minutes of meetings, organizing the work of the apparatus, and preparing materials for the leadership. But Iosif Vissarionovich managed to turn this position into an instrument of real power. He took control of all personnel appointments in the party, created a system in which any important decision required his consent, and began to form a corps of functionaries loyal to him. His influence on the appointment of secretaries of regional party organizations was particularly important. These individuals controlled the local party committees and therefore the delegates to party congresses. Gradually, a network of leaders who owed their positions to the General Secretary was formed throughout the country. At the same time, Iosif Vissarionovich strengthened his positions in other state structures. As People's Commissar for Nationalities, he controlled policy towards non-Russian peoples, which was very important in a multinational state. His influence in this sphere grew especially after the formation of the USSR in December of 1922. The creation of the Soviet Union was a compromise between different approaches to state structure. Lenin advocated a federal structure with broad rights for the republics. Iosif Vissarionovich proposed a more centralized model, autonomization, in which national regions would be part of Russia with the rights of autonomies. Lenin's point of view prevailed, but in practice, the system of governance of the USSR was much more centralized than what was provided for in the formal documents. And in this system, the key role was played precisely by the party apparatus, which Iosif Vissarionovich controlled. Meanwhile, Lenin's health continued to deteriorate. After his first stroke in May of 1922, he could no longer work with the same intensity. Periods of activity were replaced by long breaks for treatment. This created a power vacuum that inevitably had to be filled by someone. Formally, the Council of People's Commissars managed current affairs, but all the most important decisions were still made in the Politburo of the party's Central Committee. The Politburo consisted of 7 people: Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Stalin, Rykov, and Tomsky. Each of them had their own sphere of influence, their own views on the country's future development, and their own ambitions for the role of Lenin's successor. Leon Davidovich Trotsky was considered the most likely heir. He was a brilliant orator, a theorist of Marxism, and a hero of the Civil War. His name stood next to Lenin's in the minds of millions of people. Many perceived them as an inseparable pair of revolutionary leaders. But Trotsky also had serious shortcomings. He had joined the Bolsheviks late, only in 1917. Before that, he was a Menshevik. Many old party members remembered his previous speeches against Lenin and regarded him with suspicion. Furthermore, Trotsky was prone to theorizing, disliked routine organizational work, and often clashed with other leaders. His idea of permanent revolution, the immediate spread of revolution throughout the world, seemed too radical and dangerous to many. Grigory Yevseyevich Zinoviev and Lev Borisovich Kamenev were Lenin's closest associates from pre-revolutionary times. They led the two most important cities in the country, Petrograd and Moscow, had great authority in the party, and were considered guardians of Leninist traditions. But they also had weaknesses. At the decisive moment of the October Revolution, they had opposed the uprising, considering it premature. Lenin had then called them strikebreakers of the revolution. Although they were later forgiven, this episode undermined their claims to the role of heirs. Against this backdrop, Iosif Vissarionovich appeared to be the most acceptable figure. He did not have brilliant achievements like Trotsky, did not possess theoretical talents like Bukharin, and was not a close friend of Lenin like Zinoviev and Kamenev. But it was precisely this grayness that made him convenient for everyone else. Each of the factions hoped to use Iosif Vissarionovich for their own interests, not suspecting that he was using them for his. Zinoviev and Kamenev saw him as an ally against Trotsky. Bukharin considered him a supporter of moderate policy. Even Trotsky initially did not perceive him as a serious competitor. Meanwhile, Iosif Vissarionovich patiently strengthened his positions. He studied the personal files of party workers, knew their biographies, strengths, and weaknesses. He knew how to find an approach to very different people, helped them with personal problems, and created an atmosphere of mutual support and trust. His control over party cadres was particularly important. Any appointment to a serious position required the consent of the General Secretary. Gradually, a corps of leaders who understood to whom they owed their positions was formed throughout the country. In the autumn of 1922, relations between Lenin and Iosif Vissarionovich seriously deteriorated. The reason was the so-called Georgian affair, a conflict between the Moscow leadership and the leaders of the Georgian SSR. The leaders of the Georgian Bolsheviks, headed by Philip Makaradze and Budum Divani, opposed excessive centralization and demanded greater autonomy for their republic. Iosif Vissarionovich, as People's Commissar for Nationalities, supported the line of centralization and sanctioned the removal of the Georgian leaders. When Lenin learned of this, he was furious. He saw in Iosif Vissarionovich's actions a manifestation of the very great Russian chauvinism that the Bolsheviks had always fought against. In a sharp note, he called Stalin's behavior crudely Great Russian and demanded a review of the decision. This conflict showed that there were serious disagreements between the two leaders on matters of principle. Lenin began to wonder whether Iosif Vissarionovich was suitable for the role of his successor, whether too much power had been concentrated in his hands. The culmination of the conflict was a personal incident in December of 1922. Nadezhda Konstantinovna Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, complained to her husband that Iosif Vissarionovich had spoken rudely to her on the telephone when she tried to pass information to Vladimir Ilyich. The ill and irritable Lenin took this as a personal insult. He demanded an apology from Iosif Vissarionovich to his wife and threatened to break off all relations. This episode finally convinced him that the current General Secretary was not suitable for the role of party leader. It was then, in December of 1922 to January of 1923, that Lenin dictated his last notes, which would later be called his testament. In them, he gave character assessments of all the leading party figures and expressed his opinion on the prospects of their future activities. About Stalin, he wrote, Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealing among us communists, becomes intolerable in a general secretary. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his stead. These words, had they become known to the delegates of the party Congress, could have radically changed the course of history. Lenin's authority in the party was absolute, and his opinion carried decisive weight. A recommendation to remove the General Secretary would have been carried out without discussion, but fate decreed otherwise. On January 21st, 1924, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin died of another stroke. His testament remained in a safe, and the decision on whether to make it public or not was left to the members of the leadership themselves. Lenin's death was a huge shock for the entire country. Millions of people perceived him as the father of the revolution, as a symbol of the new world, as a guarantor that socialist ideals would be put into practice. Now that guarantor was gone. The leader's funeral turned into a grandiose demonstration of grief and unity. Delegations traveled to Moscow from all corners of the country to bid farewell to Lenin. His body was placed in the mausoleum on Red Square, which became a place of pilgrimage for millions of people. But behind the outward unity, a sharp struggle for the inheritance was hidden. Each of the contenders understood that the decisive moment had come, that it would now be determined who would lead the party and the country in the coming years. Joseph Vissarionovich proved himself a subtle politician and a skilled organizer during these days. He took on the organization of the funeral and delivered a mourning speech in which he vowed to fulfill Lenin's testaments. His speech made a strong impression. He spoke simply, without pathos, but very sincerely. Most importantly, he managed to prevent the public reading of Lenin's testament. Taking advantage of the fact that the document was addressed to the party Congress and not the Politburo, he proposed creating a commission to decide on its publication. The commission was composed of people he could count on. As a result, the testament was read only to a narrow circle of Congress delegates and under conditions of strict secrecy. The majority of the party never learned of Lenin's last will, and those who knew preferred to remain silent, not wanting to create a crisis during a difficult time. Meanwhile, an open struggle for power began. The first serious clash was the dispute over the prospects of the world revolutionary movement. Trotsky continued to advocate the idea of permanent revolution, arguing that it was impossible to build socialism in one country. Joseph Vissarionovich put forward an alternative concept, building socialism in one country. He argued that the Soviet Union could and should build a socialist society on its own without waiting for a world revolution. This idea turned out to be much more attractive to the broad party masses. After 7 years of wars and revolutions, people were tired of constant upheavals and wanted a quiet life and peaceful construction. The promise to build socialism at home without getting involved in new adventures found a lively response. Gradually, a coalition of supporters began to form around Joseph Vissarionovich. Zinoviev and Kamenev joined him, seeing him as an ally against Trotsky. Many regional leaders who owed their positions to him also supported him. In January of 1925, an event occurred that sharply weakened Trotsky's position. He fell ill and could not participate in the memorial events dedicated to the anniversary of Lenin's death. Joseph Vissarionovich used this to accuse his rival of disrespecting the leader's memory. In the spring of the same year, Trotsky was removed from his post as People's Commissar for Military Affairs. Formally, this was explained by the need to focus on other tasks, but in reality, it was the first serious defeat in the struggle for power. Having lost control over the army, he lost one of his most important supports. But Joseph Vissarionovich understood that the victory over Trotsky was only the first stage. A clash with other contenders, each with their own ambitions and supporters, was inevitable. His next opponents were Zinoviev and Kamenev, the very people who had helped him in the fight against Trotsky. They realized that they had underestimated their ally, that his power was growing faster than they had anticipated. In the autumn of 1925, at the 14th Party Congress, an open clash occurred. Zinoviev and Kamenev criticized the General Secretary's policy, demanded collective leadership, and warned of the danger of one-man rule. But it was too late. By this time, Joseph Vissarionovich controlled the majority of the Congress delegates. His supporters held key positions in the party apparatus, and their votes determined the outcome of any vote. The Congress supported the General Secretary. Zinoviev and Kamenev were defeated, and their influence sharply declined. Now, only two serious players remained on the political stage: Stalin and the group of Rights, led by Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin. But this confrontation would unfold in the next decade. For now, Joseph Vissarionovich could state that the first stage of the struggle for Lenin's inheritance had ended in his victory. He had become the de facto leader of the party and the country. True, officially, he still held the modest post of General Secretary. Formally, the highest organ of power remained the Council of People's Commissars, and the highest party organ was the Politburo. But in practice, all the most important decisions were made with his knowledge and consent. This was a feature of Stalin's system of power. For a long time it remained veiled, hidden behind formal institutions. Joseph Vissarionovich did not strive for grand titles and ceremonial posts. What was important to him was real power, the ability to make decisions and control their execution. By the end of the 20s, this system had finally taken shape. The country was ruled by a man who until recently had been just one of Lenin's comrades, a technical worker in the party apparatus. Now his word was law for millions of people. How did this become possible? The answer lay in the peculiarities of that time and the political system that had developed in the Soviet Union. Under a one-party regime, where the party controlled all spheres of life, control over the party apparatus meant control over the entire country. Joseph Vissarionovich understood this earlier and better than others. While his rivals fought for high-profile posts and public recognition, he patiently created a system of personal power. And when the decisive moment came, it turned out that there was no alternative to him. But this was only half the journey. Even more serious trials awaited him ahead: the fight against the opposition, collectivization, industrialization, and repressions. The years that would determine whether he could not only seize power, but also hold it, not only become a leader, but also change the country according to his vision of the future. For now, he was just the General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party, one of the leaders of the young Soviet country. But very soon, the whole world would know the name of Stalin, a name that would become a symbol of an entire era in human history. By the end of the 20s, the Soviet Union stood on the threshold of grandiose changes that would forever alter the face of the country and the destinies of millions of people. Imagine Russia at that time. It was still largely a peasant country, where 4 out of 5 people lived in the countryside, worked the land, and followed traditions passed down from generation to generation. Cities were small islands of modernity in a vast sea of patriarchal life. The new economic policy, NEP, allowed the country to recover from the devastation of the Civil War, but by the end of the 20s, it became clear that the previous pace of development was not enough. Around the USSR, capitalist states were strengthening, making no secret of their hostility towards the world's first socialist country. Joseph Vissarionovich, who by this time had already become the de facto leader of the party and the country, understood that the Soviet Union faced a dilemma. Either make a leap in industrial development and turn into a modern industrial power, or remain a backward agrarian country, doomed to defeat in the inevitable clash with external enemies. We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must cover this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us, he said in 1930. These words became the program for an entire decade. But industrialization required enormous funds. There was nowhere to get them except from agriculture. This meant that the entire system of agrarian relations had to be radically changed, forcing the peasantry to give the state much more produce than before. Furthermore, small peasant farms were inefficient and could not meet the growing needs of cities and industry for food and raw materials. It was necessary to create large mechanized farms capable of operating in a modern way. The solution to these tasks became the content of the policy called the Great Break. It was an attempt to turn the USSR from an agrarian country into an industrial power, from a backward state into an advanced one, in just a few years. But before embarking on these grandiose plans, it was necessary to finally deal with the intra-party opposition. By the end of the 20s, Joseph Vissarionovich had only one serious opponent left, the group of so-called rights, led by Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin. Bukharin was one of the party's brightest theorists, the author of many programmatic documents, and a favorite of Lenin, who called him the golden boy of the party. Unlike Trotsky or Zinoviev, he did not aspire to the role of a political leader, preferring to engage in theoretical work. But it was precisely on questions of economic policy that his views radically diverged from Stalin's. Bukharin advocated for the continuation of the NEP, for gradual development, for an alliance with the peasantry. His famous call to the peasants, "Enrich yourselves," became a symbol of a moderate economic policy. Joseph Vissarionovich, by the end of the 20s, had come to the conclusion that the NEP had exhausted its potential, that radical measures were needed to accelerate development. He believed that one could not rely on the initiative of the peasantry, that the state should take control of the entire economy. A clash between the two approaches was inevitable. The pretext for it was the grain procurement crisis of the winter of 1927-1928. The peasants, dissatisfied with low procurement prices, sharply reduced the sale of grain to the state. Bread shortages began in the cities, and a rationing system had to be introduced. This was a serious political crisis that could undermine the authority of the Soviet government. Decisive measures needed to be taken urgently. Joseph Vissarionovich personally traveled to Siberia, one of the country's main grain-producing regions. There, he applied methods that would later be called extraordinary measures. Grain was forcibly confiscated from the peasants, those who resisted were arrested, and markets were closed. These measures yielded quick results. The grain was collected, and the food crisis in the cities was overcome. But they meant a de facto rejection of the principles of the NEP, a return to the methods of war communism. Bukharin and his supporters were outraged by this turn of events. A new phase of the intra-party struggle began. Bukharin accused Joseph Vissarionovich of departing from Leninist principles, of returning to the policy of war communism, of breaking the alliance of the working class with the peasantry. He warned that coercion could lead to peasant uprisings and the collapse of Soviet power. Joseph Vissarionovich responded that the old methods did not correspond to the new tasks, that one could not depend on the mood of the peasantry, that the state must plan and control the entire economy. He accused the rights of opportunism and capitulation in the face of difficulties. The struggle lasted for more than a year and ended in the complete defeat of Bukharin's group. By this time, Joseph Vissarionovich had full control of the party apparatus. All key posts were held by his supporters. The rights had no real levers of influence. In April of 1929, Bukharin was removed from all leading posts. He was accused of creating an anti-party group and of a right deviation. Other leaders of the rights, Alexei Ivanovich Rykov and Mikhail Pavlovich Tomsky, also lost their influence. Now, Joseph Vissarionovich had no serious opponents left in the party leadership. All members of the Politburo were his supporters or fellow travelers. He could proceed with his plans to transform the country without fear of resistance from above. But the main difficulties awaited him not in party offices, but in the countryside, among the multi-million-strong peasantry, which was not at all eager to change its accustomed way of life. And here he was, to face resistance far more serious than the opposition of party intellectuals. The first task was the collectivization of agriculture, the merging of small peasant farms into large collective farms, or kolkhozes. Officially, this was presented as a voluntary movement of the peasants themselves, striving for more efficient farming. In reality, collectivization was imposed from above by administrative methods. The authorities set the task of uniting the vast majority of peasant households into kolkhozes in the shortest possible time. Thousands of party workers were sent to the localities to carry out this task. Collectivization was carried out particularly actively in the grain-growing regions, in Ukraine, the Volga region, the North Caucasus, and Siberia. The wealthiest peasant farms, which could provide the state with the necessary amount of grain, were located here. But the peasants offered stubborn resistance. They did not want to give up their land, livestock, and equipment, which they considered their property, for common use. Mass discontent erupted into open protests, which the authorities suppressed by force. To overcome the resistance, a campaign was launched against the kulaks, the most prosperous part of the peasantry. The kulaks were declared class enemies who were hindering the socialist reconstruction of the countryside, and they began to be liquidated as a class. This liquidation was carried out by the most brutal methods. Kulak farms were dekulakized, all their property was taken away, and they themselves were exiled to remote areas where they had to perform hard physical labor in special settlements. But who was to be considered a kulak? There was no clear definition. In practice, not only genuinely wealthy peasants were declared kulaks, but also anyone who opposed collectivization. This created an atmosphere of terror in the countryside, where anyone could be accused of hostility to Soviet power. The peasants responded to the coercion in their own way. Unwilling to give their livestock to the kolkhozes, they began a mass slaughter of animals. The number of cattle, pigs, and sheep decreased several times over. This was real economic sabotage that caused enormous damage to agriculture. By the end of 1930, the situation in the countryside had become critical. Collectivization was being carried out at such a pace and with such methods that it threatened the complete collapse of agriculture. In some areas, real peasant uprisings began. Joseph Vissarionovich realized that it was necessary to slow down the pace and change the methods. In March of 1931, his article, "Dizzy with Success," was published, in which he condemned the excesses in collectivization and placed the blame for them on local workers. This article helped to diffuse the situation a little. Some peasants left the kolkhozes, and the repressions temporarily weakened. But the general line of collectivization did not change. It was simply carried out more cautiously now, without unnecessary fuss. In parallel with collectivization, industrialization was unfolding, the construction of new plants and factories, the creation of a modern industry. This task was no less complex than the transformation of agriculture. In October of 1928, the first 5-year plan for the development of the national economy was adopted. It provided for a 2.5-fold increase in industrial production, the creation of new industries, and the technical re-equipment of the entire economy. These plans seemed fantastic. Never before in history had any country tried to change the structure of its economy so quickly. Skeptics predicted that the plan would fail, that the attempt at forced industrialization would lead to economic collapse. But Joseph Vissarionovich was determined. "There are no fortresses that Bolsheviks cannot take," he said. The entire country was mobilized to fulfill the 5-year plan. The construction of new enterprises was carried out on an unprecedented scale. Giant plants were erected: the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works, the Stalingrad tractor plant, the Gorky automobile plant, the Dnieper hydroelectric station. These construction projects became symbols of a new era, the embodiment of the dream of turning Russia into a modern industrial power. People had to work in incredibly difficult conditions. There was a shortage of qualified personnel, modern equipment, and basic amenities. Builders lived in barracks, worked 12 to 14 hours a day, in winter and summer, in rain and snow. But the enthusiasm was truly massive. Millions of people sincerely believed that they were building a new world, creating the foundations of future prosperity. The Stakhanovite movement, socialist competition, and shock brigades were all forms of labor enthusiasm of those years. Particular attention was paid to the development of heavy industry, metallurgy, machine building, and chemistry. It was these sectors that were to become the basis of the country's economic and military power. Light industry and the production of consumer goods took a back seat. Funds for industrialization were raised in various ways. Grain, timber, oil, and even art from museums were sold abroad. Taxes were raised and loans were issued, to which the population subscribed not always voluntarily. But the main source of funds was agriculture. The kolkhozes were obliged to hand over huge quantities of products to the state at low prices. In fact, this was a hidden form of taxation on the peasantry, which thus financed industrial construction. The price of industrialization turned out to be very high. The standard of living of the population in the early 30s was lower than at the end of the 20s. There was a shortage of the most necessary goods in the stores, food was distributed by ration cards, and housing conditions worsened. But the results were impressive. During the first 5-year plan, more than 1,500 large industrial enterprises were built. The production of machinery and equipment increased several times over. The USSR turned into one of the world's leading industrial countries. The creation of a defense industry was especially important. Aircraft and tank factories were built, as well as enterprises for the production of artillery and ammunition. This was vital, given the growing military threat from Nazi Germany. In parallel with economic transformations, deep social changes were taking place. Millions of peasants moved to the cities and became workers. The number of engineers, technicians, and managers grew. A new social structure of an industrial society was being created. Great attention was paid to education. Universal primary education was introduced, and the network of technical schools and universities was expanded. Tens of thousands of young people received engineering education and became specialists in new industries. Science developed. New research institutes were created, and work was carried out to master new technologies. Soviet scientists achieved significant success in various fields, from physics to biology. But all these achievements were accompanied by a growing repressive policy. As resistance to collectivization and industrialization intensified, the authorities increasingly resorted to coercion and punishment. A wide network of correctional labor camps, the Gulag, was created, where millions of prisoners were held. Among them were actual criminals, political opponents of the regime, and simply people who fell victim to repressions due to denunciations or random accusations. Prisoner labor was widely used on the construction sites of the 5-year plan. They dug canals, built roads, and mined coal and ore in the most severe conditions. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, the Moscow-Volga Canal, and many industrial facilities were built by the hands of camp inmates. But Joseph Vissarionovich viewed all these sacrifices as an inevitable price for the historical transformation of the country. He was convinced that he was building the foundation for future prosperity, that without these temporary difficulties, it was impossible to create a powerful socialist state. By the mid-30s, the main tasks of the Great Break had been solved. The USSR had been transformed from an agrarian country into an industrial power. The collectivization of agriculture was largely completed. A powerful industry capable of producing the most complex types of machinery was created. But this transformation came at an incredible cost to the country. Millions of people died from famine, repressions, and backbreaking labor. The traditional way of life, followed by generations, was destroyed. A society based on coercion and fear was created. However, it was precisely this sacrifice and mobilization of all resources that allowed the USSR to withstand the coming war with Nazi Germany. The industry created during the 5-year plans produced tanks and airplanes. The management system, fine-tuned during the process of collectivization, ensured the supply of the army. By the end of the 30s, Joseph Vissarionovich had become not just a political leader, but a real dictator whose power knew no bounds. Cities and factories were named after him, his portraits hung in every institution, and his quotes were studied in schools and universities. A cult of personality of an unprecedented scale was formed. Stalin was portrayed as a brilliant theorist and practitioner, an infallible leader, a faithful student of Lenin and the continuer of his cause. Any criticism of his actions was considered a state crime. But the main thing was that a system was created that could mobilize all the country's resources to solve any tasks. This system was cruel and economically inefficient, but it possessed enormous mobilization capacity. And very soon, this capacity would be tested by the most severe trial in human history, the Great Patriotic War. Then it would become clear whether the sacrifices made during the years of the Great Break were justified, whether the country had managed to prepare for the mortal combat with fascism. For now, Joseph Vissarionovich could be satisfied with the results. In 10 years, he had turned a backward agrarian country into a powerful industrial state, created the foundations of a modern economy, and built a management system capable of solving the most complex tasks. True, the price of these achievements was monstrously high. But these were not just sacrifices for the sake of sacrifices. It was the price for historical acceleration, for an attempt to cover in a decade a path that other countries took centuries to travel. And new trials lay ahead, which would show how strong the foundation laid in these difficult years had turned out to be. June 22nd, 1941. This day forever divided the history of our country into before and after. Imagine a quiet Sunday morning. All along the western border of the Soviet Union, people were waking up in their homes, unaware that in a few hours their lives would change forever. In border towns, they were preparing for graduation balls, planting seedlings in their summer cottages, and children were making plans for the summer holidays. And at that time, hundreds of German bombers were already taking off from airfields in East Prussia, Poland, and Romania. Tank columns, infantry divisions, and artillery regiments were moving towards the border. Operation Barbarossa, the plan for a lightning-fast defeat of the Soviet Union, had begun. Joseph Vissarionovich worked late in the Kremlin that night, as usual. The last few months had been particularly tense. Alarming reports were coming in about the concentration of German troops at the border, and diplomats were reporting a sharp deterioration in relations with Germany. But he did not believe that Hitler would dare to attack the USSR without finishing the war with England. It contradicted all the laws of military strategy to fight on two fronts. Besides, there was a non-aggression pact between the countries signed in August of 1939. This pact was a major diplomatic achievement for Stalin. It allowed him to avoid a war on two fronts, with Germany in the west and with Japan in the east. It provided a respite to complete preparations for the inevitable clash with fascism. It allowed for the annexation of the Baltic states, western Ukraine, and western Belarusia to the USSR. Of course, this treaty with Hitler caused shock throughout the world. Communists and fascists were considered irreconcilable enemies, but Joseph Vissarionovich had always been a pragmatist. He used any opportunity to strengthen his country's position. "We avoided war with Germany for 1.5 to 2 years, he explained to his entourage. These 1.5 years were spent on rearming the army, building defensive fortifications, and evacuating industry from the border areas. But there was still not enough time. The Red Army was in the process of reorganization. Many experienced commanders had been repressed in 1937, 1938. New types of weapons were just beginning to arrive in the troops. The fortifications on the old border had been dismantled, and new ones had not yet been built. When, at 3:30 in the morning on June 22nd, the chief of the General Staff, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, woke Stalin with a call and reported the bombing of Soviet cities, he was silent for a few seconds. Then he only said, "Come to the Kremlin." The next few hours were spent in frantic meetings. It was necessary to understand the scale of what was happening, to make the first decisions, to organize resistance to the aggressor. But the information coming in was fragmentary and contradictory. Communication with the border districts was being cut off. The first reports were catastrophic. German aviation had bombed many airfields, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft right on the ground. Enemy tank columns were breaking through deep into the territory, surrounding entire divisions. Command of the troops was disrupted. At 12 o'clock noon, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, spoke on the radio. His trembling voice brought the terrible news to the country. Today, at 4 o'clock in the morning, without a declaration of war, German troops attacked our country. Joseph Vissarionovich was unable to address the people that day. He was overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe, unable to find the words to explain what was happening. The man who was used to controlling everything suddenly found himself facing events beyond his control. The first weeks of the war became his most difficult ordeal. The army was retreating on all fronts. The Germans took Minsk, Riga, and approached Leningrad. Millions of Soviet soldiers were surrounded. It seemed that the country was on the brink of collapse. Stalin was especially devastated by the news that his eldest son, Yakov, had been taken prisoner. The Germans offered to exchange him for Field Marshal Paulus, but his father refused. "I will not trade a soldier for a field marshal." Personal tragedy intertwined with the nation's grief. But gradually, he pulled himself together. On July 3rd, his speech to the people was broadcast on the radio, beginning with the unusual words, "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of our army and navy." Never before had he addressed the people so warmly and trustingly. There was no usual propaganda rhetoric in this speech. He honestly said that the enemy had captured a large territory, that the country was in mortal danger, that all forces needed to be mobilized to repel the aggressor. His words sounded convincing and instilled hope in millions of hearts. "Our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours," he concluded his speech. These words became the slogan for the entire war, a symbol of unwavering faith in final victory. From the first days of the war, Joseph Vissarionovich took direct command of military operations. The State Defense Committee, GKO, was created, an emergency body for managing the country in wartime. He himself became the chairman of the GKO. Then he headed the Stavka of the Supreme High Command, the highest body of strategic leadership of the armed forces. All military and state power was concentrated in his hands. Every important decision was made with his consent. This was an enormous responsibility. The fates of millions of people, the outcome of gigantic battles, and the future of the country depended on his decisions. He worked 18 to 20 hours a day, delved into the smallest details, and demanded reports from the fronts every few hours. The Stavka was located in an underground bunker beneath the Kremlin. Here, on huge maps, the positions of the troops were marked, reports from the fronts were received, and orders were sent to the commanders. This was the military center of a giant country. The first strategic task was to stop the German offensive and prevent the enemy from capturing Moscow. The capital had not only symbolic, but also practical significance. The main railway lines converged here, and the most important enterprises were located here. The Battle of Moscow began in October of 1941. The German Army Group Center launched a final desperate offensive, striving to take the capital before the onset of winter. The operation was codenamed Typhoon. At first, the offensive developed successfully. The Germans surrounded large groups of Soviet troops near Vyazma and Bryansk and advanced hundreds of kilometers. Panic began in Moscow. People abandoned their homes and tried to evacuate to the east. Joseph Vissarionovich decided to stay in the capital. "I am not leaving Moscow," he declared at a Politburo meeting. This decision had enormous psychological significance. If the leader had left Moscow, it would have been perceived as an admission of defeat. A state of siege was declared in the city. Barricades were built, people's militia units were formed, and the most important institutions and factories were evacuated. But the majority of Muscovites remained and prepared for defense. On November 7th, the traditional parade in honor of the anniversary of the October Revolution took place on Red Square. In ordinary times, this was a solemn event, but now it turned into a demonstration of steadfastness. Units went straight to the front from the parade. Joseph Vissarionovich ascended the tribune of the mausoleum and delivered a speech that traveled around the world. He recalled the great Russian military leaders, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kuzma Minin, and Dmitry Pozharsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov. May the courageous image of our great ancestors inspire you in this war. This appeal to history was not accidental. In the first months of the war, it became clear that communist slogans alone were not enough to mobilize the people. It was necessary to appeal to deeper layers of national consciousness, to patriotic traditions. The war came to be called not just the Patriotic War, but the Great Patriotic War, in analogy with the War of 1812 against Napoleon. Old military ranks were restored, orders named after great military leaders were established, and epaulets and other elements of pre-revolutionary military symbolism were brought back. By the end of November, the Germans had approached Moscow to within 30 to 40 kilometers. They could see the domes of the Kremlin cathedrals through their binoculars. It seemed that the capital was about to fall. Hitler was already preparing for a victory parade on Red Square. But the offensive petered out. Soviet troops offered fierce resistance. Frosts began, for which the German army was not prepared. And most importantly, reserves arrived from Siberia and the Far East, fresh divisions armed with the latest equipment. On December 6th, a counteroffensive began near Moscow. This was the first major victory for the Red Army, the first serious defeat for the Germans in the Second World War. The enemy was pushed back from the capital by 100 to 250 kilometers. The victory near Moscow had enormous strategic and psychological significance. It showed the whole world that the German army could be beaten, that the Blitzkrieg plan had failed. The USA and England became convinced that the USSR was capable of resisting and increased their Lend-Lease assistance. For Joseph Vissarionovich, this victory was the first serious success. He understood that the war would be long and difficult, but the country was capable of withstanding it. Now it was necessary to prepare for a long struggle, to mobilize all resources to achieve final victory. The winter of 1941-1942 brought some respite. The front stabilized, providing time to regroup forces, replenish losses, and prepare for new battles. Special attention was paid to the restoration of industry. During the first months of the war, 1,400 enterprises were evacuated to the east. Factories from Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine were relocated to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. This was a grandiose operation, the likes of which history had never known. Millions of people, along with their equipment, moved to the deep rear, where they launched the production of military equipment in the shortest possible time. Often, machines were installed right in the open air, and then workshops were built around them. Everything for the front, everything for victory. This slogan became the meaning of life for millions of Soviet people. In the rear, they worked 12 to 14 hours a day, regardless of fatigue. Women, teenagers, and the elderly took their places at the machines. Joseph Vissarionovich personally supervised the production of the most important types of weapons. He knew how many tanks and planes were produced each month, what problems hindered the increase in output, and what was needed to solve them. He was particularly concerned about the shortage of experienced personnel. The war had consumed millions of skilled workers and engineers. It was necessary to train new specialists in a rush, simplify technology, and search for non-standard solutions. But Soviet industry coped with these tasks. By the end of 1942, it was producing more tanks and aircraft than Germany. The enemy's quantitative superiority was eliminated. In the summer of 1942, the Germans launched a new major offensive in the south towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. They hoped to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the most important transport artery, the Volga River. Soviet troops were again forced to retreat. The Germans reached the foothills of the Caucasus and laid siege to Stalingrad. It seemed as if they were repeating the success of the previous year. Panic spread throughout the country. Joseph Vissarionovich understood that the enemy could not be allowed to capture Stalingrad. This city bore his name, and its fall would have enormous psychological significance. Moreover, the loss of the Volga would indeed create serious problems for supplying the army. On July 28th, the famous Order Number 227 was issued, better known as Not One Step Back. It stated, "It is time to end the retreat, not one step back. This must now be our main call." This order introduced harsh measures against those retreating without orders. Blocking detachments were created, which were supposed to shoot at those fleeing. Penal battalions were formed from offending officers. Panic-mongers and cowards were to be shot on the spot. The order was brutal, but it met the needs of the moment. The army needed strict discipline, a clear understanding that there was nowhere further to retreat. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," said the defenders of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted for more than 6 months and became one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Fights were fought for every house, for every street. Opponents engaged in hand-to-hand combat in basements and attics. Joseph Vissarionovich received daily reports from the banks of the Volga. He knew many of the city's defenders by name, followed their heroic deeds, and awarded the most distinguished. Stalingrad became a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the Soviet people. But at the same time, a grandiose operation was being prepared to encircle the German grouping near Stalingrad. Plan Uranus was developed in the deepest secrecy. The plan was to launch simultaneous strikes from the north and south to close the ring around Paulus's army. On November 19th, the counteroffensive began. Soviet troops broke through the front on the flanks and, after 4 days, linked up near the town of Kalak. More than 300,000 German and Allied troops were trapped in the cauldron. This was a brilliant strategic operation that fundamentally changed the course of the war. The Germans lost an entire army, the best army of the Wehrmacht. The initiative finally passed to the Soviet troops. Joseph Vissarionovich demanded the complete liquidation of the surrounded group. He rejected proposals for an honorable surrender and insisted on unconditional capitulation. On February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of Paulus's army ceased their resistance. The victory at Stalingrad became a turning point not only on the Soviet-German front, but in the entire Second World War. It became clear that Germany was losing the war, that its military machine was broken. The Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition appreciated the scale of the Soviet contribution to the common victory. Joseph Vissarionovich became a full-fledged member of the Big Three. Together with Roosevelt and Churchill, he decided the fate of the post-war world. In November of 1943, the Tehran Conference took place, the first meeting of the leaders of the USSR, the USA, and England. Joseph Vissarionovich traveled outside his country's borders for the first time to participate in international negotiations. At the conference, plans for the final defeat of Germany were discussed. The Allies agreed on the opening of a second front in Europe, on the coordination of military actions, and on the principles of the post-war world order. Joseph Vissarionovich made a strong impression on the Western leaders. They expected to meet a crude dictator, but saw a calm, judicious politician who knew his interests well and knew how to defend them. "Stalin is a man with whom you can do business," President Roosevelt said after the meeting. Churchill, despite fundamental disagreements, also noted his outstanding abilities as a statesman. Meanwhile, fierce battles continued on the fronts. In the summer of 1943, the Germans launched their last major offensive operation, Citadel, an attempt to encircle Soviet troops on the Kursk Bulge. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. More than 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns participated from both sides. On July 12th, a grandiose head-on tank battle took place near the village of Prokhorovka. The Germans were defeated. Their last strategic reserves were exhausted, and the initiative finally passed to the Red Army. A general offensive of Soviet troops began along the entire front. One after another, the occupied territories were liberated. In the autumn of 1943, the left bank of Ukraine was liberated and Kiev was taken. In the winter, an offensive began in Belarusia and the Baltic states. Joseph Vissarionovich closely followed the course of operations. He demanded decisive actions from the commanders and did not allow the enemy to gain a foothold on intermediate lines. "Beat the enemy to complete destruction," such was his motto. By the beginning of 1944, it became clear that the war was nearing its end. The Red Army was approaching the borders of the USSR, preparing for a liberation campaign in Europe. A second front was opened in Normandy, but the hardest trials were over. The country had withstood the mortal combat with fascism. The industry was working at full capacity. The army was equipped with the best types of weapons in the world. The people believed in victory and were ready to go all the way. In February of 1945, the Yalta Conference took place. There, the issues of the post-war world order were finally decided. Joseph Vissarionovich achieved recognition of the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. On May 9, 1945, Germany capitulated. The Great Patriotic War was won. The Soviet Union, as part of the anti-Hitler coalition, made a decisive contribution to the defeat of fascism. This was the greatest victory in the history of Russia, but its price was monstrous. About 27 million Soviet people perished. Half the country was destroyed, millions of people were left homeless, and the economy lay in ruins. For Joseph Vissarionovich, the war became the supreme test and the greatest triumph. He managed to mobilize all the country's resources, unite the people in the face of mortal danger, and lead the country to victory over the strongest opponent. His role as a military leader remains a subject of debate. He made many mistakes, especially at the beginning of the war. But he managed to learn from these mistakes, surround himself with talented military commanders, and create an effective system of troop control. Most importantly, he managed to find the right words to address the people, to awaken in them a readiness for self-sacrifice, and to link the fight against fascism with the defense of the fatherland. The war became truly a people's war, and in this lay the guarantee of victory. On the evening of May 9th, he addressed the nation on the radio. The great sacrifices we have made in the name of the freedom and independence of our motherland, the innumerable deprivations and sufferings experienced by our people during the war, the intense labor in the rear and at the front laid on the altar of the fatherland, have not been in vain and have been crowned with complete victory over the enemy. These words summed up 4 years of unprecedented trials. The country had withstood, won, and proved its viability. Now it was necessary to restore the ruined economy, heal the wounds of war, and build a peaceful life. And Joseph Vissarionovich transformed from the leader of a warring country into the leader of a great power, one of the architects of the post-war world order. New tasks awaited him ahead, no less complex than the military ones. But this was already a different era, with different challenges and problems, and the war will forever remain a time when the country and its leader went through the supreme test and emerged victorious. May 1945. The war was over, but for Joseph Vissarionovich, perhaps the most difficult chapter of his life was beginning. Imagine a man who for 4 years bore on his shoulders the responsibility for the fate of a huge country, for the lives of millions of people. Every day brought reports from the fronts. Every decision could cost thousands of lives. And now the roar of cannons had ceased, the last shots had faded, and a long-awaited silence had fallen. But this silence was deceptive. The country lay in ruins. 27 million dead, destroyed cities, burned villages, millions of disabled people and orphans. Industry was reoriented to military needs, agriculture was devastated, and transport was paralyzed. And most importantly, the world around was changing with dizzying speed. Yesterday's allies in the anti-Hitler coalition were becoming adversaries. A new era was beginning, an era of confrontation between two systems, two ideologies, two ways of life. Joseph Vissarionovich understood this better than many. Even during the war, when meeting with Roosevelt and Churchill, he saw that they were united only by a common enemy. As soon as Germany was defeated, a struggle for spheres of influence, for the right to determine the future of the world, would begin. On June 24, 1945, the Victory Parade took place on Red Square. It was a grandiose spectacle. Victorious regiments marched across the cobblestones, and the banners of the defeated German units were thrown at the foot of the mausoleum. The country was celebrating its greatest triumph. Joseph Vissarionovich stood on the tribune of the mausoleum and reviewed the parade. He was 66 years old, with a quarter of a century in power behind him, and 4 years of the most difficult war. He had reached the pinnacle of his power, becoming one of the architects of the New World Order. But inside, he felt tired. The war had taken too much of his strength. His health was undermined by sleepless nights and constant tension. Doctors increasingly spoke of heart problems, high blood pressure, and the need for rest. However, there was no time to rest. The country faced grandiose tasks of reconstruction. It was necessary to rebuild the destroyed cities, restore industry, and establish a peaceful life. And all this was in the context of a growing confrontation with former allies. The first signs of the future Cold War appeared as early as 1945. Disputes over the fate of Poland, disagreements over Eastern Europe, conflicts in Iran and Turkey. All this testified to the deep contradictions between yesterday's allies. Relations became particularly acute after the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Joseph Vissarionovich perceived this not only as a strike against Japan, but also as a warning to the Soviet Union. The United States was demonstrating its new weapon, showing who was now the master of the world. "They want to intimidate us," he told his associates, but it was impossible to intimidate him. On the contrary, the appearance of the atomic bomb in American hands only convinced him of the need to create his own bomb. The USSR could not afford to remain defenseless against the new threat. Work on the Soviet atomic project had begun during the war, but now it acquired paramount importance. Joseph Vissarionovich personally supervised this program, allocated enormous resources to it, and involved the country's best scientists. The head of the project was Igor Vasilyevich Kurchatov, a young but already famous physicist. He was given unlimited authority and any resources that were required. "Do whatever is necessary to create the weapon," Joseph Vissarionovich instructed him. In parallel with the atomic project, the restoration of the national economy was unfolding. In March of 1946, the fourth five-year plan was adopted, covering the period from 1946 to 1950. This plan provided not just for the restoration of the pre-war level, but for a significant increase beyond it. By the end of the five-year period, industrial production was to grow by 48% compared to 1940. The tasks were grandiose, but the country took them on with the same enthusiasm as it had for the pre-war five-year plans. Destroyed factories were restored, new enterprises were built, and new technologies were mastered. Special attention was paid to the development of heavy industry and the defense complex. Joseph Vissarionovich understood that in the conditions of the nascent Cold War, one had to be ready for any turn of events. Peacetime could turn out to be just a respite before a new battle. But economic recovery was only one side of the coin. The other side was the formation of what would later be called the socialist camp, a group of Eastern European countries that followed the path of socialist development. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania. All these countries were liberated by the Red Army and were now in the Soviet sphere of influence. The task was to help them build a socialist society on the Soviet model. This was a complex and delicate process. It was necessary to take into account the national characteristics of each country, the traditions, and the mentality of the peoples. One could not simply impose the Soviet model, it had to be adapted to local conditions. Joseph Vissarionovich personally met with the leaders of the Eastern European countries, studied their problems, and gave advice on carrying out reforms. He saw the creation of the socialist camp not only as an expansion of Soviet influence, but also as the embodiment of the dream of world socialism. He developed particularly close relations with the Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito. This partisan commander had liberated his country largely on his own and enjoyed enormous authority among the Yugoslavs. At first, Tito seemed like the ideal ally, a devoted communist, an experienced revolutionary, a charismatic leader. But gradually, disagreements began to arise between him and Joseph Vissarionovich on issues of foreign policy and internal structure. Tito wanted to pursue an independent policy without coordinating every step with Moscow. He dreamed of creating a Balkan federation that would unite the Yugoslav peoples with the Bulgarians and Albanians. These plans did not please Joseph Vissarionovich. "He is too independent," Stalin said of the Yugoslav leader. In 1948, a final break occurred. Yugoslavia was expelled from the Cominform, the organization of communist parties, and the USSR ceased economic aid. This conflict became the first serious crack in the socialist camp. It showed that even communist countries could have their own interests, which did not always coincide with the interests of the USSR. But for now, this was the only setback. In the other countries of Eastern Europe, socialist transformations were proceeding successfully. Communist parties came to power, industry was nationalized, and the collectivization of agriculture began. Meanwhile, relations with the West continued to deteriorate. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his famous speech in the American city of Fulton, in which he declared that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Joseph Vissarionovich responded with an interview in the newspaper Pravda, in which he called Churchill's speech a call to war with the USSR. Thus began a war of words between East and West that would last for decades. In 1947, the Americans announced the Marshall Plan, a program of economic aid to European countries. Formally, the plan was open to everyone, including the USSR and the countries of Eastern Europe. But Joseph Vissarionovich saw this as an attempt at economic enslavement. "They want to buy Europe," he said, and forbade the Eastern European countries from participating in the plan. Instead, their own Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CMEA, was created. The apogee of the confrontation was the Berlin blockade of 1948-1949. When the Western powers decided to create a single German currency in their occupation zones, Joseph Vissarionovich blocked all land routes to West Berlin. This was a serious political crisis that could have led to a new war. The Americans organized an airlift, supplying Berlin by air. For several months, the world teetered on the brink of catastrophe. But Joseph Vissarionovich did not want war. He understood perfectly well that the country had not yet recovered from the previous war, that time was needed to regain strength. The blockade was lifted, the crisis was resolved, but relations with the West reached a freezing point. Under these conditions, the creation of Soviet atomic weapons acquired special significance. On August 29, 1949, the first test of a Soviet atomic bomb was conducted at the Semipalatinsk test site. "This will change everything," Joseph Vissarionovich said upon receiving the report of the successful test. The American atomic monopoly was broken. Now the USSR also possessed the most terrible weapon in human history. The news of the Soviet bomb had the effect of an exploding bomb in Western capitals. Many politicians and military officials believed that the Russians lacked the scientific potential to create an atomic weapon. They had miscalculated. But Joseph Vissarionovich was not going to stop there. Work was already underway on the hydrogen bomb, an even more destructive weapon. In parallel, delivery systems were being developed, missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads over long distances. The creation of atomic weapons required enormous resources and effort. Entire cities of scientists and engineers worked, secret factories were built, and rare materials were mined. But the result justified all the costs. The USSR became a nuclear superpower. Simultaneously with the strengthening of defense capabilities, the restoration of the civilian economy continued. By the end of the 40s, the pre-war level of industrial production had not only been restored, but significantly surpassed. New plants and factories were operating in the country, hydroelectric power stations and canals were being built, and new deposits of mineral resources were being developed. The Soviet Union was turning into a most powerful industrial state. True, the standard of living of the population remained quite low. Priority was given to heavy industry and defense, while the production of consumer goods developed slowly. People lived modestly, content with the bare essentials. But an atmosphere of enthusiasm and faith in the future reigned in society. The country had won the most terrible war in its history, created the atomic bomb, and become one of the two superpowers in the world. It seemed that the Soviet people were capable of any task. Joseph Vissarionovich was at the zenith of his power during these years. His authority was absolute, his word, law for hundreds of millions of people. He controlled not only the USSR, but also a significant part of the world. But with age, he became increasingly suspicious and mistrustful. The war had shown that even the most loyal people could turn out to be traitors. Now he trusted no one, seeing conspiracies where there were none. In the late 40s, a new wave of repressions began. The first victim was the so-called Leningrad affair, a fabricated charge against a group of party and state officials associated with Leningrad. Among those repressed was Nikolai Alexeyevich Voznesensky, the chairman of Gosplan, one of the architects of the post-war reconstruction. He was accused of creating an anti-party group, of trying to set Leningrad against Moscow. There was no real basis for these accusations. Voznesensky was a loyal party member, a talented organizer, and one of Joseph Vissarionovich's closest associates. But the dictator's suspicion knew no bounds. Along with Voznesensky, hundreds of other people were repressed: party workers, economic managers, and military personnel. Many of them were shot, while others received long prison sentences. These repressions showed that even after the war, even during a period of triumph, the country could not get rid of the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Anyone, even the most decorated person, could at any moment become an enemy of the people. The fate of the Jewish intelligentsia was particularly tragic. In the late 40s and early 50s, a campaign against cosmopolitanism was launched, a veiled form of anti-Semitism. Jewish theaters and schools were closed, publications in Yiddish were discontinued, and writers and journalists were arrested. The culmination was the doctors' plot, an accusation against a group of doctors, mostly Jews, of attempting to poison Soviet leaders. Joseph Vissarionovich personally supervised this case. He was convinced that the doctors really wanted to kill him, that there was an international conspiracy against the USSR. His morbid suspicion had reached its peak, but the doctors' plot was never brought to its conclusion. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Vissarionovich died of a stroke. Death caught him in the midst of a new repressive campaign. The last years of his life were overshadowed by illness and loneliness. He trusted almost no one in his entourage, lived as a recluse in his residences, and rarely appeared in public. The power that had once brought him satisfaction became a heavy burden. Doctors had long warned of problems with his heart and blood vessels. High blood pressure, atherosclerosis, and constant stress all undermined his health. But he refused to follow medical recommendations, not even trusting his attending physicians. On March 1, 1953, he was found unconscious in his study at the Kuntsevo Daka. He was paralyzed and could not speak. For several days, his associates hoped for his recovery, but on March 5th, his heart stopped. Stalin's death marked the end of an entire era. For 30 years, he had stood at the head of a huge country, determining its fate and influencing the course of world history. Now this era had come to an end. The funeral turned into a grandiose demonstration of grief. Millions of people came to say goodbye to the leader. Many wept sincerely. For them, He was a symbol of victories and achievements, the personification of the country's greatness. But there were also those who secretly sighed with relief. These 30 years had brought too much fear and suffering. All these grandiose construction projects and campaigns had cost the country too dearly. What did he leave behind? How should one evaluate this man, whose life was so closely intertwined with the fate of a huge country? On the one hand, his achievements were truly grandiose. A backward agrarian country was transformed into an industrial superpower. The most terrible war in human history was won. A powerful state was created, capable of competing on equal terms with any country in the world. On the other hand, the price of these achievements was monstrous. Millions died from famine and repressions, destinies were ruined, and an atmosphere of fear and suspicion prevailed, a system based on coercion and violence. He was a man of his time, a time of great upheavals and grandiose tasks. Perhaps under different circumstances he would have become different, but history knows no what-ifs. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin remained in the memory of posterity as one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century, a man who was both a creator and a destroyer, who led the country to great victories and condemned it to great suffering. His biography is the history of Russia in the 20th century, with all its ups and downs, triumphs and tragedies, the history of a country that was searching for its path in a turbulent century and paid a huge price for it. Now that decades have passed, we can look at this era more calmly, try to understand its logic, and draw lessons for the future. But one thing remains unchanged. This history concerns each of us because we are all heirs of that time. And the little Georgian boy, Soso, who once dreamed of becoming a priest, remained forever in the memory of the world as Stalin, the man who changed the course of history. Such is the story of one destiny that became the destiny of an entire country and influenced the destinies of the whole world. A story that teaches us how important it is to remember the past in order not to repeat its mistakes, and that no achievements, however great, are worth paying for with human lives and human dignity. And so we have come to the end of our long story. Having lived through these 74 years with you, from the birth of little Soso in the Georgian town of Gori to the death of the all-powerful leader of a huge empire, we have passed through an entire era of human history, an era that changed not only the fate of one country, but the face of the entire world. When I began this story, I promised not to judge or evaluate, but simply to tell the story of one human life. And now, at the end of our journey, I want to keep that promise, because judging the past is a thankless task. There is too much we do not know. Those times were too complex, and the same events can be interpreted in too many different ways. But it is necessary to sum up, if only to try to understand. What kind of life was this? What did it give to the world? What lessons can be learned from it? Imagine Russia in 1878, when Joseph Jugashvili was born, and the Soviet Union in 1953, when Stalin died. These are two completely different countries, two different worlds. In the first Russia, Tsar Alexander II ruled, the peasants had only recently received their freedom, industry was taking its first steps, and the majority of the population was illiterate. The country lived by laws that had been formed over centuries, slowly and cautiously entering the era of modernization. In the second Russia, already the Soviet Union, ideas invented by a German philosopher and brought to life by a handful of Russian revolutionaries ruled. It was an industrial superpower with nuclear weapons, a space program, and a powerful army, a country that claimed the role of leader of half of humanity. Over these 75 years, a complete transformation of a huge empire took place. And at the center of this transformation stood a man born into the family of a poor shoemaker in a provincial Georgian town. How did this become possible? How could a boy from the social dregs rise to the pinnacle of power and for 30 years determine the destinies of hundreds of millions of people? The first and most obvious answer is that he lived in an era of great upheavals. Revolutions, wars, and social cataclysms created opportunities for exceptional people capable of acting in extreme conditions. Ordinary times produce ordinary people. Extraordinary times require extraordinary personalities. Joseph Vissarionovich possessed qualities that were highly sought after in his era. An iron will, the ability to make difficult decisions, the skill to mobilize people to solve grandiose tasks. He was not afraid of responsibility, did not retreat in the face of difficulties, and was ready to go to the end to achieve his goals. But personal qualities alone would not have been enough. Favorable circumstances were also needed, and such circumstances came together. The fall of Tsarism opened the way to power for revolutionary parties. The Bolshevik victory in the Civil War established the dictatorship of one party. Lenin's death created a power vacuum that needed to be filled, and each time Joseph Vissarionovich found himself in the right place at the right time, able to use the opportunities that opened up. His biography is a classic example of how a talented person can use historical circumstances to achieve power. But power is only an instrument. The main question is, how was this instrument used? And here we come to the most difficult and painful questions, because Stalin's activities were extremely contradictory. On the one hand, there were undeniable achievements. On the other, monstrous crimes. Let's be honest, the achievements were truly grandiose. In 30 years, the country made a gigantic leap in its development. From a backward agrarian periphery of Europe, it turned into one of the two world superpowers. A powerful industry capable of producing the most complex types of machinery was created. Thousands of plants and factories were built, railways were laid, and power stations were erected. A country that imported machinery and equipment at the beginning of the 20th century was exporting them by the middle of the century. A cultural revolution was carried out. Illiteracy was eliminated. A system of universal education was created, and millions of specialists were trained. The country of peasants and workers gave the world outstanding scientists, designers, writers, and artists. The most terrible war in human history was won. The USSR made a decisive contribution to the defeat of fascism and saved the world from the Brown Plague. This victory cost incredible sacrifices, but without it, humanity could have gone down a very different path. The world's second nuclear power was created. Under the conditions of the American atomic monopoly, this was vital for ensuring the country's security. The Soviet bomb restored the strategic balance in the world. Finally, a socialist camp was formed, a group of countries that tried to build a just society based on Marxist ideas. This experiment was not successful, but the attempt itself was grandiose. All these achievements cannot be denied or belittled. They became a reality, changed the course of world history, and influenced the destinies of billions of people. And in these achievements, Joseph Vissarionovich played a huge role as a political leader and organizer. But there was another side to his activity, the side that cannot be forgotten, even while acknowledging his merits. Millions of people died of hunger during collectivization. Millions were repressed, went through the camps, and lost their families and health. Entire peoples were subjected to deportation, lost their homeland, and were condemned to suffering. A system of total control over society was created where the state interfered in all spheres of human life. People could not freely choose their work, place of residence, or express their opinions. Any dissent was brutally suppressed. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion reigned. Anyone could at any moment become an enemy of the people, be arrested, convicted, or shot. Children informed on their parents, friends betrayed each other, and no one could be trusted. The very idea of socialism was perverted. Instead of a society of equality and justice, a new form of despotism arose, where the ruling elite enjoyed all the privileges while ordinary people were content with promises of a bright future. And all this, too, cannot be denied or justified. This is also part of the legacy of the Stalinist era, and perhaps the heaviest part. So, how should these two sides be reconciled? Can achievements justify the victims? Or do the victims cancel out all the achievements? I think this is the wrong way to frame the question. History does not have simple answers. It is much more complex than our moral categories. We cannot put achievements on one scale and victims on the other and say which outweighs the other. Every human life is priceless. No one can be sacrificed for any goals, no matter how noble. From this point of view, any repression is unjustified, any violence is criminal. But history is not only morality, but also an objective process. And in this process, people act with their own ideas of good and evil, with their own goals and methods of achieving them. Joseph Vissarionovich was convinced that he was building a just society, that he was creating the foundations for the future prosperity of humanity. He sincerely believed in the correctness of Marxist doctrine, in the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the possibility of building communism. This belief justified any sacrifices in his eyes. "When you chop wood, chips fly," he used to say, and for him, human lives were precisely such chips. For the sake of a great goal, a part of humanity could be sacrificed. Of course, from a modern point of view, such an approach is monstrous. We know that no goals can justify mass murder, that the value of human life is absolute. But he lived in a different time, with different ideas about morality and politics. Moreover, one must not forget the time in which he lived. The first half of the 20th century was an era of unprecedented cruelty. World wars, revolutions, genocides, all this was the norm, not the exception. Violence became a common way of solving political problems. Hitler exterminated 6 million Jews and millions of other people. Mao Zedong in China caused the deaths of tens of millions of peasants. Pol Pot in Cambodia exterminated a quarter of his country's population. Against this background, Stalin does not look like an exceptional villain. He was typical of his era. This is not an excuse, but an attempt at understanding. We must condemn the crimes of the past, but we must also try to understand why they became possible, what gave rise to them, and how to prevent their repetition. And here it is important to understand that Joseph Vissarionovich was not a born villain, a monster who enjoyed the suffering of others. He was a man of his time who sincerely believed in the correctness of his actions. His tragedy, and the tragedy of his era, was that noble goals were attempted to be achieved by unworthy means. The dream of a just society was realized through violence and terror. The idea of equality was implemented through the destruction of entire social groups. This tragedy was not only personal but also historical. It showed that the most sublime ideas can lead to the most terrible consequences if they are implemented by people who are not constrained by moral principles. But let's try to look at the figure of Stalin not only as a political figure but also as a person. What do we know about his inner world, his experiences, what he was like in his private life? Alas, we know quite little about this. Stalin was always a secretive person. He did not like to be frank, and he carefully concealed his true thoughts and feelings. He created an aura of mystery around himself that persists to this day. But we do know some things. He loved to read. His library contained thousands of books with his annotations. He was interested in history, especially the history of Russia, and knew many poems by Russian poets by heart. He loved movies, often watching films in the Kremlin cinema hall. He loved Georgian songs and knew folk music well. He could be charming in conversation when he wanted to win someone over. He had a family, his wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, a daughter, Svetlana, and sons Vasily and Yakov. But his family life was tragic. His wife committed suicide, his eldest son died in German captivity, and his younger son became an alcoholic. Svetlana recalled that her father could be tender and caring, played with her, and told her fairy tales. But more often he was stern and distant, completely absorbed in state affairs. Perhaps this was another of Stalin's tragedies. He sacrificed not only millions of other people's lives to power, but also his own humanity. He became a function, a system, a mechanism of power, ceasing to be just a person. And yet, he was once an ordinary boy who dreamed of becoming a priest, wrote poetry, and fell in love with girls. What turned this boy into a dictator, feared by millions of people? I think it was a gradual transformation that took place over decades. The years of underground struggle hardened his character, taught him not to trust people, and instilled in him the conviction that the end justifies the means. The Revolution and the Civil War showed that violence can be an effective political tool. The power struggle in the 20s convinced him that there is no place for sentimentality in politics, and having received absolute power, he gradually lost touch with reality, surrounded himself with flatterers and careerists, and came to believe in his own infallibility. Power corrupted him, as it corrupts many people. But perhaps it was not only Stalin's personal qualities, but also the very nature of the system that developed in the USSR. A system based on one-man rule inevitably breeds dictators. Lenin was also cruel and merciless, and also used terror as a political tool. But he died early, without having had time to build a complete dictatorial system. Stalin completed his work, creating a system of power that could function only with a single leader, and this system outlived its creator. After Stalin's death, other people came to power, but the foundations of the system remained unchanged. Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, they were all products of the same system that did not allow for fundamental changes. Only in the late 80s did this system begin to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Gorbachev's perestroika was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire created by Stalin. Now, more than 70 years after his death, we can assess his legacy more calmly. Time has washed away the emotions and allowed us to see historical processes in a broader perspective. And we see that Stalin's legacy is extremely contradictory. On the one hand, the system he created proved to be unviable and collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and communist ideology suffered a collapse. On the other hand, much of what was created in the Stalinist era remains to this day. The industrial base, scientific schools, the education system, cultural traditions, all this, to one degree or another, dates back to those years. Russia today remains a great power largely thanks to the foundation that was laid in the 30s to 50s. Of course, this foundation has been modernized and adapted to new conditions, but the basis was created back then. Moreover, the experience of Stalinist industrialization turned out to be in demand in other countries. China, India, and many countries in Asia and Africa used the Soviet model of accelerated modernization to overcome their backwardness. True, they tried to avoid the extremes that were characteristic of the Stalinist regime. But the very principle of a mobilization economy, state planning, and the concentration of resources on priority areas proved to be quite viable. So Stalin's legacy is not limited to the USSR. It has a global character and has influenced the development of many countries around the world, and in this sense he was indeed one of the key figures of the 20th century. But how should we treat this legacy today? How can we use the lessons of that era in modern conditions? It seems to me that the main lesson is that no goals, no matter how noble, can justify crimes against humanity. Any attempts to build a paradise on earth through violence and terror are doomed to failure. The second lesson is the danger of concentrating power in the hands of one person. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, turning even decent people into tyrants. That is why democratic institutions, the separation of powers, and public control over the state are so important. The third lesson is the importance of human life as the highest value. No one can be sacrificed for any abstract ideas. Every person has the right to life, liberty, and dignity. The fourth lesson is the danger of utopian thinking. Attempts to build an ideal society according to a pre-designed plan inevitably lead to violence against reality, to the suppression of everything that does not fit into the Procrustean bed of theory. The fifth lesson is the necessity of gradual evolutionary changes. Revolutionary leaps most often turn into tragedies for millions of people. Slow but steady progress is much better than fast but destructive changes. These lessons are relevant not only for Russia, but for the whole world, because the temptation to solve all problems at once, to build a just society by force, exists everywhere and always. And here it is important to remember the experience of the Stalinist era, not to repeat it, but to avoid repeating its mistakes. But there are also other lessons, positive ones. The experience of that era showed that people are capable of incredible achievements when they are united by a common goal. The enthusiasm of the builders of the first 5-year plans, the heroism of the defenders of the motherland during the war, all these are examples of what a person is capable of. It also showed the possibility of rapid modernization of backward countries. Of course, at the cost of monstrous sacrifices, but the fact remains, in a few decades, an agrarian country can become an industrial power. Finally, the experience of the USSR showed the importance of education, science, and culture for the development of society. Investing in people, in their knowledge and abilities, this is the best investment a state can make. And so we come to the main question: how to evaluate the personality of Stalin himself. Was he a villain or an outstanding statesman? A criminal or a hero? I think he was both at the same time. Or, more precisely, he was a man who committed both great deeds and great crimes. Both are parts of his personality, his legacy. We cannot erase from his biography either industrialization or collectivization or the victory in the war or the repressions. All of this happened. All of it is part of the history of our country and the whole world. Perhaps this duality is the main characteristic of the figure of Stalin. He was a man of extremes who knew no middle ground. Everything about him was maximal, both achievements and crimes. This maximality makes his figure both attractive and repulsive at the same time. Some see him as a great leader who turned Russia into a superpower. Others see a cruel tyrant who destroyed millions of innocent people. And both are right, in a certain sense, because Stalin was indeed both. This is his historical uniqueness and, at the same time, his human tragedy. And what did he think of himself? Unfortunately, we do not know. He left no memoirs, diaries, or candid letters. His inner world has remained a mystery to us, but we can assume that he considered himself an outstanding statesman who was solving grandiose historical tasks. Perhaps he sincerely believed that the sacrifices were necessary, that without them, the set goals could not be achieved. Or maybe, deep down, he understood the full horror of what he was doing but could not stop. Power had sucked him in like a swamp, and he could no longer get out. We will never know. Joseph Vissarionovich took his secrets to the grave. Only the deeds remain, both good and bad. And so now, in the 21st century, we are trying to understand this man, to assess his role in history, to draw lessons from his life. This is not an easy task because the figure of Stalin is too complex for unambiguous assessments. But it is necessary to try to understand it, because it is part of our history, part of our past. And our future largely depends on how we understand and assess this past. Stalin belongs to history, but history belongs to us, living people who must draw conclusions from the experience of the past. And the main conclusion we must draw is to never again allow power to be concentrated in the hands of one person, to never again allow people to become a means to achieve political goals. A person must be the goal, not the means. This is the main lesson of the Stalinist era, and we must remember it. And the little Georgian boy Soso, with whom our story began, will forever remain in history as Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, one of the most contradictory and significant figures of the 20th century. His life was not lived in vain. It changed the world, influenced the destinies of billions of people, and left a mark that will never be erased. Whether this is good or bad is not for us to judge. It is simply a fact of history, and let everyone draw their own conclusions from this story. The main thing is that we remember the past, learn from its mistakes, and do not repeat them in the future, because history is not only a story about what was, it is also a lesson about what can be, and it depends on us what our tomorrow will be like. Good night, friends. May you have sweet dreams, and may a new day begin in the morning, free from the mistakes of the past and full of hope for a better future. After all, this is what the millions of people of that great and terrible era, which we have remembered today, fought and lived for.